Chapter 35 Discovery. The black gold worm, once it landed on the ground, was motionless. After a while, the antennas started to wave, reaching out in every direction. No wonder it was a fourth-grade black gold worm. Zuamo praised it silently. This kind of intelligence was not something normal lingworms would have. The black gold worm raised its head after a while. The two antennas in the front slightly shook as it quickly crawled along the ground. It sometimes stopped or sometimes slowly proceeded. Zuamo carefully casted the control spell, tightly following the worm from behind, not daring to relax his watch even slightly. Other than the ling fields, various weeds dominated all other areas of the valley. This created some difficulties for Zuamo. He took out the ice crystal sword that Shixiang had given him to cut out a path. Grasping the translucent ice crystal sword in his hand, it gave off a kind of bone-aching cold. The good thing was the blade was extremely sharp and pretty good at cutting up grass and wood. Suddenly, the black good worm stopped but then went at an even faster speed. It went deep into the grass-covered land. Zuamo instantly became alert. Carrying the icy crystal sword, he followed right after. The black gold worm stopped in front of a protruding rock. Following closely behind, Zuamo narrowed his eyes and started to examine this large piece of rock. The rock was a normal granite, about 50 or 60 feet tall. From the outside, there was nothing special about it. Was the mystery located inside the rock? In any case, this place was his own private one. It didn't matter how he played with it. Lifting up the ice crystal sword, he started to dig at the rock. Granite might be hard, but facing a third-grade flying sword, it was like tofu. In a short while, Zuamo dug out a large hole. As expected, the black gold worm climbed into the hole. This caused Zuamo to be even more motivated, his hand moving faster. This rock was even bigger than he had imagined. When he dug for more than an hour, and it was 70 or 80 feet deep, it still hadn't reached the bottom. In the end, Zuamo wasn't one of those that cultivated the body. His two arms seemed to be filled with lead, his entire body almost falling apart. No way, it's killing me. He collapsed on the ground, panting as he looked dispiritedly at the black gold worm lying on the bottom of the hole. Bro, you are really obsessed. Go, can't do it, need to sleep first. He grimaced at the black gold worm. Finishing, he fell into a deep sleep in the hole he had just dug. When Zuamo opened his eyes, he saw a patch of blackness. Sitting up, the moonlight came in through the opening of the hole. The inside of the hole was slightly illuminated. The black gold worm was still silently motionless at the bottom of the hole, the gold coin on its back releasing a faint gold light in the dark of the rock hole. It was already night. Zuamo drifted off into his thoughts for a while before he took up the ice crystal sword again. Brother, let us continue. Ding ding dong dong. The continuous sound of a sword cutting rocks rang inside West Wind Valley. Zuamo continued to dig mechanically straight down until the sky was almost filled with light. Zuamo suddenly felt the icy crystal sword in his hand had cut into empty space. His heart instantly jumped, his exhaustion swept away. Putting power into his hands, he quickly cut out the last thin piece of rock. Behind the rock was a large black hole. Zuamo's heart couldn't help but beat wildly. The black gold worm didn't hesitate. Flashing into the black hole, it quickly vanished. Zuamo forced himself to swallow his spit, and he hesitated for a moment before holding the ice crystal sword and squeezing into the black hole. The black hole was much deeper than he had imagined. As he went deeper, his heart became heavier. There were clear signs of human cutting in here, but it would have been long ago since there was a strong moldy odor in the cave. Who had made a dwelling here? Was this the tomb of one of the sex elders? This guess made him very excited. He walked quickly into the deeper regions. There was a thin connection being maintained between him and the black gold worm. He was able to know things about the situation ahead. Very quickly he saw the black gold worm. In the darkness, the gold coin mark of the black gold worm could be seen from far away. The black gold worm was spread out over a lump, unwilling to leave. Zuamo scanned the surroundings. This was a very crude stone room. There was a spring in the corner, a stone desk, a stone bed, and nothing else. When he went closer, Zuamo was frightened out of his wits. The black gold worm was actually on a pile of bones. Zuamo's heartbeat increased. His mouth became dry. He resisted the great terror inside himself and walked for a closer look. He didn't know whose remains these were. It was spread out on the ground. From the appearance, it seemed to have been a long time ago. He looked around. His eyes suddenly became dumbstruck, and then he showed a joyous expression. This was the death place of one of the sect's elders. With the fastest speed possible, he picked up the various jade sticks and talismans on the ground. He seemed like an extremely hungry beggar who suddenly saw bread. There weren't many talismans, and it had been too long since they were supported with Ling energy. Their functions were almost entirely gone. In comparison, there were many more jade sticks, about 20 or so. He explored every corner, not leaving anything behind before Zhuomo's eyes once again went back to the pile of bones. The black gold worm was lying on that pile of bones, motionless, but the gold coin mark on the back seemed slightly brighter. To have died here, it definitely was his sect's elders. He had received such a big convenience from them. Pondering for a second, Zhuomo bowed 3 times to the pile of bones, and then lightly buried the bones in a corner. Moving away the bones, Zhuomo found that there was actually a prayer mat underneath the bones. Prayer mat? He blinked. This white mat. It was almost the same as the mat that the nameless Shixiang had left behind in the seclusion room at Zhuomo's little yard. He hurriedly poured out the jade sticks that he had put away in front of him. One by one, he poured Ling energy in. After a while, he managed to generally understand the cause and effect. This rock room was the death place of an elder in the sect, but this elder was actually an outer sect disciple. What Zhuomo felt even more unimaginable was that this was the elder who had always been an outer sect disciple, but almost managed to enter Jindan, who was also the previous owner of Zhuomo's little yard. The matters of the world were just this fantastical. Zhuomo dumbly sat there and couldn't help but sigh. This Shixiang, called Wei Nan, was an outer sect disciple from 300 years ago. He had a special ability. He was naturally sensitive to Ling veins. So he could find that weak Ling vein, build the little yard and painstakingly cultivate her. Even though he had the help of the Ling vein, but he didn't have good talent at cultivating, and just barely kept up with the other disciples. He had great ambitions, and didn't want to live a mediocre life. He racked his brains and thought of all kinds of methods. In many places, Wei Nan Shixiang was extremely similar to Zhuomo Wei. Nan also chose Ling plant farmer as his best path to riches. However, his talents in the area of the 5 elements were not as good as Zhuomo's, and it took him 5 long years before he barely became a Ling plant farmer. But Wei Nan didn't tell anyone else. From then on, he started to learn how to make Dan, yet his talents in making Dan was also average. After spending 10 years, he finally managed to make his first 4th grade Ling Dan. He developed slowly in cultivation, yet his talent developed rapidly. He was even able to detect the Ling veins buried deep underground. When he was 37, he found this Ling vein. Afraid that the sect would take it away if they knew, he quietly created this rock room. Taking advantage of the Ling veins, he finally reached Ningmai at 40 years of age. At this time, he was still an outer sect disciple. Wei Nan was extremely talented at concealment and pretense. No one in the sect managed to find that his cultivation had risen to Ningmai. Due to the fact that his potential truly was too average, he was afraid that his Ningmai cultivation would cause the elders in the sect to be suspicious, and from that, find the sect of the Ling veins. He was satisfied with seclusion. After painstaking management through the years, he had some measure of wealth. He continuously purchased all kinds of jade sticks. What he learned was extremely broad and mixed. He didn't know what caused it, but in that period of time, the progression of his Ling energy became faster. He was extremely happy, and put even more effort into collecting all kinds of jade sticks. The more odd the jade stick, the more he was obsessed. And no matter how strange the jade stick, he would always try it out. When he had reached 50 years old, the number of spells and scriptures he needed to practice each day reached 15 kinds. At that time, he knew he had no hope of entering Jindan, and killed off his dream. In the following 20 years, he started to organize and study the variety of odd jade sticks and scriptures that he had collected. His cultivation was limited, but his scope of knowledge and spells was very wide. There weren't many that could compare to him. In addition, He had cultivated many of the unpopular scriptures for a few decades and had many conclusions. Comparing the different scriptures, he finally managed to finish the summary and organization of all the types of scriptures he had collected through his lifetime. In total, there were 20 sticks. No name, nothing too profound. It was the last thing he left in this world. Carefully putting away the jade sticks that were on the ground, Zuemo was full of respect for this elder Wei Nan. He lifted the mat, went to the spring and carefully poured water over to wash it. Even though so many years had passed, after a gentle wash, the mat once again recovered its snowy white appearance. This mat wasn't something ordinary. It was made from meditation grass, and its effect was to calm the heart. It wouldn't decay, won't have worms for hundreds of years. It was much rarer than the mat from the little yard. He put the mat back in its original spot and sat on it. A thickling energy seemed to pour in through his skin. He quickly entered mediation and became motionless. Beside the mat, the black gold worm was also motionless, abnormally quiet. Only the gold coin mark on the back flashed with a gold light. When he woke up from meditation, Zuemo couldn't disguise the ecstasy in his eyes. This Ling vein, compared to the Ling vein in his little yard, was much greater. If the Ling vein in the seclusion room of the little yard could be said to be a small branch, then this Ling veins was like the stem. The abundant Ling energy made one unconsciously comfortable. With such a high-quality Ling vein, he could quickly enter Zhuji. He had decided in the future, this would be his secluded cultivation room. When Zuemo squeezed out of the rock hole, the blinding sun outside made him unconsciously narrow his eyes. Turning and carefully covering up the hole, he scattered the granite that he had dug out into the weeds. Nothing could be seen. After finishing, he released a breath. Just at this time, Liang Feng came looking for him with other people. Because there wasn't any buildings in West Wind Valley. If Zuemo was going to live inside the valley, then it required building a house. She was naturally in charge of this kind of matter, and personally came to ask about Zuemo's preferences and needs. After attentively listening to Zuemo's demands, she waved her hands, and the other outer sect disciples instantly started to move. In half a day, a little yard was built. Zuemo named it the Little West Wind Yard. The Little West Wing Yard became his new home. Chapter 36 Encounter again. The Little West Wind Yard became one of the important places in Wukong Sword Sect, especially for outer sect disciples. Its importance far surpassed the residences of all other inner sect disciples. The great majority of outer sect disciples farmed, and what they were most afraid of were problems in the Ling fields. Having a Ling plant farmer in the sect, they felt more secure. At least when a problem occurred now, they knew they could find someone. A brand new yard appeared in the valley. The outside walls were constructed from limestone. The fine patterns and the cool hardness of the limestone added a few hints of serenity and peace. The vines were like a waterfall, the stars in the sky occasionally reflecting, glittering and speckled. The pond in the yard wasn't the mud pond in his previous residence. First-grade purple fire lotus were planted in the pond. The purple lotus flowers were like purple flames that were burning in the water. In the night, they would release a hazy purple light. Between the purple fire lotuses, the silver scissor fish swam happily. It was like countless blades crashing together, dozens of silver lines intersecting, blinding to the eye. Zuemo wasn't in the mood to admire the beautiful scenery. Just like before, he would go to Cold Mist Valley at the same time every day to make rain and take care of the plants. Now that he was an inner sect disciple, the rule that it was not allowed to fly inside the mountain was not valid for him. Putting on the spirit traveling seal, each of his steps was a small flight. His speed wasn't slower than those flying steeds. Other than saving a lot of time, he enjoyed the process very much. These days, during the daytime, he was like normal as he cared for the Ling fields. At night, he would quietly run to the Ling vein in the rock room to meditate and practice embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation. Even though the primary purpose of embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation was to cultivate the spirit, but the increase in Ling energy was also pretty good and much better than 10 principle scripture. Adding on the help of the Ling vein, after a few days, his progress was astounding. Without him detecting it, his cultivation quietly broke through to the 9th level of Lianqi. The Ling vein in the rock room became Zuomo's biggest secret other than Pu Yao. He was especially careful. In order to disguise the opening, he just didn't use a piece of granite to seal the entrance. He also planted large amounts of weeds and shrubs around the opening. From the outside, there was nothing that could be detected. His only worry was that elders like his master, or the sect leader, would come here. So he didn't dare to put out any jinji. With his skill, the jinji he would create would be completely ineffective against the sect leader and the other, and would arouse their attention instead. His days were extremely leisurely. Other than the provision of jingshi each month, there was also a provision of ling grains. He had planted ling grains for 2 years, yet had never ate it before. The ling grains were filled with rich ling energy, and when it was absorbed, it was extremely gentle, unlike the forceful nature of the ling energy absorbed from the jingshi, and used if one had to go to some special places like Bloody Heaven metropolis Jia. 3,000 years ago, Yama were defeated. In order to preserve their strength, the last remaining 100 or so great powers of the Yama, using their own bodies and blood as the guide, as 7 medium Jia as the axis, 49 little Jia as the screen to create Bloody Sky metropolis Jia, and stopped the Xiuzha in their steps. Inside Bloody Sky metropolis Jia, all of the ling energy became extremely unrefined and unordered. Xiuzha basically had no way of absorbing it. Those that traveled to Bloody Sky metropolis Jia, they always needed to bring large amounts of jingshi and ling grains. Jingshi was used to replenish the normal usage of ling energy. But due to the fact that the ling energy in jingshi was extremely strong, relying only on jingshi could easily cause the cultivation to collapse. While the ling energy in the ling grains were not as potent as it was in jingshi, but it was gentle and could help Xiuzha stabilize their cultivation. The disciples in some large sects would use ling grains every day to increase the speed of cultivation. But for a small sect like Wukong Sword sect, they would only provide a certain amount each month. And it was only low-grade ling grains. But even just first-grade ling grains, Zuomo had never eaten any before. Zuomo was presently studying the jade sticks that Elder Wei Nan had left. Even though Elder Wei Nan's cultivation had been limited, but many of the roads he had walked were worthy for Zuomo to use as reference, such as farming. Elder Wei Nan had been a ling plant farmer, and had learned how to make dan. How similar was that to Zuomo? Zuomo hadn't thought to touch the obscure scriptures yet. How to earn jingshi? It was what he needed to think about right now. What was easiest to earn jingshi within Lianqi? What to plant? Finally getting 20 mu of 3rd grade ling fields, Zuomo naturally wanted to organize it well. Right now he had no money, completely wrung dry by Pu Yao. The allowance from the sect each month wasn't an insignificant amount, but for him, it was just a drop in the bucket. Things like ling veins couldn't be converted directly to jingshi, but even if it was possible to sell it, Zuomo definitely wouldn't sell it. To surrender long-term benefits for short-term gains, how would such a shrewd person like him do such a stupid thing? Thinking of ways to earn jingshi was one of the most important matters of Wei Nan. Actually, for every single Xiuzha, jingshi was a problem that couldn't be avoided. The amount of jingshi earned directly influenced the speed of cultivation. Talismans, jade sticks, materials. What didn't require jingshi? Even though Zuomo was now an inner sect disciple, and the sect would put effort into nurturing him and give him conveniences in each area, but it was limited. But compared to Zuomo's circumstances, Wei Nan's past circumstances were much more difficult. The paths that he had explored were extremely worth of reference to Zuomo sitting on the gray-beaked goose that the sect had given him. Zuomo took big and small pouches as he sat idly on the goose's back. These things, all of them were what others had given him which he couldn't use. He planned on turning all of it into jingshi, even though it really wouldn't be a lot, but right now he had no other way. Hoping that Pu Yao could spit out some jingshi, that was impossible. Pu Yao always sat with his eyes closed on the gravestone every day. He seemed to be meditating. Did he need to cultivate too? Zuomo was very curious. Right now he wouldn't actively interact. Pu Yao's mood was fickle, ruthless and crazy. Yet his power was extremely deep. This kind of person, you never knew what his next step would be. You never could guess what he was thinking inside. You also never would know what his true aims were. Zhuemo felt that Pu Yao was a true devil. He would give you enticements that made your soul shake. And just when you are enjoying it to the limit, you would fall to the lowest level of hell. The torments Pu Yao gave him, Zhuemo had hated, had raged, had felt hopeless. But when Master had said that his features had been changed and his mind erased, these emotions that had troubled him dissipated like smoke. Because he needed power. Because he needed answers. These petty torments, what was it really? He clearly remembered the unfamiliarity he felt when he first woke up 2 years ago. In these 2 years, the voice that appeared in his dreams tormented him countless times. He had been afraid, terrified, hesitant, uncertain. He had thought of trying to find answers but had no clues. There was nothing he could do. So he muddled his way through the days and was never happy. Right now he was awake. He only had one thought. He needed to find the answer. Who did all this? Unable to be forgiven. On the back of the gray-beaked goose, Zhuemo looked at Dong Fu appearing through the clouds. He tightened his fist. Dong Fu was the same as usual, people streaming. Zhuemo headed straight for the free market and found Fu Jin. Fu Jing's eyes were extremely sharp. Seeing the spring sprout jade metal on Zhuemo's waist, his entire person blanked. After a while he recovered, even though shock still remained in his eyes, but he piled a smile on his face. Congratulations, little Mo-gu, little Mo-gu. TSK. Such a youngling plant farmer, little Mo-gu is definitely extraordinary. Come in. Zhuemo didn't waste pleasantries. With a bang, he threw the large bag at Fu Jin. Sell these things for me. What things? Fu Jin asked as his hands rapidly opened the cloth bag. With just one sweep, he could generally determine the value of these things. There were many items, but they weren't valuable. It was actually normal. The Lianqi outer sect disciples, they couldn't give anything valuable. His brain moved rapidly and quoted a generous price. 50 pieces of second-grade jinshi. How about it? Zhuemo knew the market. These things definitely wasn't worth 50 pieces of second-grade jinshi. He shook his head. Too much, 30 pieces is good. All right. Fu Jin briskly handed over the jinshi and put away the items. With a smile he said, now that little Mo-gu has flourished, don't forget to support this little brother. The two chatted a bit more. Zhuemo listened very carefully. Don't estimate the kind of small business people like Fu Jin. Their intuition was extremely sensitive. Any movements in the market couldn't be concealed from their eyes. Between the words, Fu Jin was extremely worried. Recently, the price of the Ling grains was continuously rising. This was the first time it had occurred in the recent years. Each year, people would go to Bloody Sky Metropolis to hunt Yao, but the price of Ling grains had never been as exaggerated as this. Connecting it to the recent rumors about Bloody Sky Metropolis, it made people worried. According to Fu Jin, it wasn't just Tian Yu Jia. The price of Ling grains and all the other Jia were continuously rising. All of this clearly showed that the conflict in Bloody Sky Metropolis was become even more intense. Was the Yaoma starting the counterattack? After hearing Fu Jin's words, Zhuemo's heart became slightly heavier. For low-level Xiuzha, the greatest danger was turmoil if a great war like the one 3,000 years ago started. Low-level Xiuzha was the cannon fodder that would die the quickest. Oh, it's really a small world. Fate lets enemies meet. A strange voice interrupted Zhuemo's musing. He raised his head and a headache started. The two people in front of him, one of them was the Dongqi sword sect disciple, whose flying sword had been cracked by him the last time. The person at the side was very unfamiliar. It probably was his Shixiang. His presence was even greater. Fu Jin was extremely perceptive. Seeing the situation, he instantly felt bitter inside but pushed a smile on his face. Sirs, come. Everyone sit down and drink some tea. Pa! The voice instantly stopped. Fu Jin was thrown flying like a sandbag. Trash! Is there space for you to talk here? The other took away his hand and said icily. Zhuemo hadn't thought the other would start punching right away. He hadn't managed to react in time. He hurriedly ran over to support Fu Jin. Looking at the hand mark on the face, and the blood spilling from the corner of Fu Jin's mouth, Zhuemo's eyes became dark. He carefully helped Fu Jin up, and then slowly turned around. Who was so stupid and let their dog out? Zuaemo stared at the one that had moved, his finger caressing the gold sword ring. That guy's face instantly became flushed. In a rage, "UF." The voice suddenly stopped. A sword energy, carrying a faint cloud of frost energy, pointed straight at his forehead. Chapter 37 Two Blows. The two Xiozha from Dongqi sword sect clearly hadn't thought that Zuaemo dared to move first. Especially the one that had moved first. In his perspective, if Tu Ningmai hadn't suddenly appeared in that previous encounter, Zuaemo would have been easily dealt with. This Lianqi trash, he dared to actively provoke the two? The sword energy almost reached the Dongqi disciple's forehead. The faint cold energy made him abruptly wake up. He instinctively pushed out his flying sword, but suddenly remembered that his flying sword had been ruined by this guy in front of him. He didn't manage to dodge in time, and got brushed by the faint mist surrounding the sword energy. Hiss! A bloody wound the width of a finger appeared on his forehead. The Dongqi disciple managed to steady himself, his eyes full of hatred as he stared viciously at Zuaemo, wanting to cut Zuaemo to pieces. This damned guy in front of him. He was clearly only in the stage of Lianqi, but every time they met, he himself would become extremely sorry. Reaching up to touch the wound on his forehead, he saw the blood on his finger. His viciousness rose and he roared angrily. "You want death? If I don't kill you today." Taking advantage of the time he took to speak, Zuaemo sent out another blow. The thin sword energy contained a faint mist as it headed for the other's open mouth. This sword energy was even stronger than the one before, the white mist shrouding it even thicker. If one listened carefully, they could almost hear a stream of tinkling as the icicles crashed. The pupils of the Dongqi disciple that had been spectating from the side suddenly shrunk. Zuaemo had been clever in his timing to send out the sword energy, the speed even faster than before. The other's flying sword had been ruined by Zuaemo. He had actually come today with his Shixiang to help him pick a new flying sword. He hadn't thought he would meet his enemy. When he detected the sword energy, he suddenly realized that it wasn't just his flying sword that had been ruined, but he didn't have any other defensive talisman on his body. Usually, he amused himself by bullying others and neglected his cultivation. Seeing the sword energy coming near, in his panic, he completely didn't know what to do. Pa! The misty sword energy accurately landed on the other's mouth. The blood instantly flew, two teeth landing on the ground. This string of attacks completely stupefied him. He covered his mouth, looking in disbelief at the two teeth on the ground. Zuaemo kept his guard up. Compared to the excitement of the battle last time, he was extremely calm this time. The only thing he could rely on was the gold sword ring. But the gold sword ring could only store 3 sword energies. Zuaemo only had the last sword energy remaining. It was his last and only attack. If the other was only one person, he would unhesitatingly add it on. But he was very clear that the two people's strength were above him, yet he could not just stand by and see Fu Jin be humiliated because of him. The worst case would be getting beaten up viciously. He already prepared to endure it. He wouldn't release this last sword energy easily. He wanted to make it a vicious one. They won't end well. Zuaemo thought viciously. Ah! The other gave a shocking howl, his features twisted and his eyes sprouting fire. "Aye!" The voice once again stopped abruptly. It seemed that an invisible hand was chalking his neck. His entire body slowly rose, leaving the ground. Compared to roaring a second ago, he was now like a fish out of the water, eyes bulging, speaking but unable to make any noise. Zuaemo was astounded. His eyes couldn't help looking towards the side. A young person dressed in white slowly moved in their direction. He didn't even look at the Dongqi disciple hanging in the air. "Dongfu does not allow fighting, don't you all know?" The other Dongqi disciple furrowed his toes. He suddenly raised a hand. A sword energy shot out of his fingertip, stopped and twisted, like drawing a plum branch. The disciple that had been fighting with Zuaemo landed with a plop, face deep purple and unconscious. "Sir, you are too biased. Both sides were fighting yet you only blame one person. It isn't fair." The white-clad youth stared at the other. "Dongqi Zhongming Yan? A little humble name. Didn't think that sir would have heard it. Honored, honored." Zhongming Yan raised his hands in a greeting, his expression still cold. Elder Zhume Tian's disciple. It naturally rings in my ears. The white-clad youth said noncommittally. Zhong Mingyan raised an eyebrow. Sir is. You buy. The white-clad young person gave 2 characters. Oh. Zhong Mingyan responded faintly, but his voice then turned sharp. So it is the honored disciple of Elder Tian Songzi. However, can brother you tell me, why only punish my sect's disciples? Does brother you discriminate against my Dongqi disciples? Yubai smiled. He pointed with a finger at the jade medal at Zuomo's waist. Only now did Zhong Mingyan notice the spring sprout jade stick at Zuomo's waist. He blanked for a second before nodding his head. Ling plant farmer, I understand. Giving a deep look to Zuomo, he turned to leave. Yubai imperceptibly furrowed his brow. Is sir not taking your shitty with you? Zhong Mingyan didn't even turn his head, heading forward, leaving behind a sentence. A piece of trash that can't even win over a Lianqi Ling plant farmer. What's the use? Yubai shook his head and didn't speak. He casually sent out a stream of white light that entered the sky. Flying sword messages. Compared to little thousand cranes, flying sword messages were much faster. As expected, in a short while 2 Xiuzha flew over and landed, bowing to Yubai. Yubai pointed to the unconscious Dongqi disciple on the ground, stating, this person broke the prohibitions of Dongfu, and is now exiled from Dongfu. Yes. The 2 bowed to Yubai, and lifted the person with them as they flew away. If I didn't see it wrong, you are the disciple of Wukong Sword Sect's Elder Xian Yan. Yubai turned his face and said warmly to Zuomo. Zuomo shook his head. My master is Shifeng Rong. The time that the other 2 had fought had been very short, but no matter if it was Ling energy, or the manipulation of spells, they were hundreds of times better than Zuomo. And both of them had vast and intimidating presences. Zhong Mingyan was cold and sharp, Yubai confident and carefree. They were all outstanding. However, Zuomo didn't feel very comfortable. No matter if it was Zhong Mingyan or Yubai, their bodies would unconsciously give an aura of being high up. Zuomo disliked the aura very much. Unconsciously, he didn't want to have deeper relations with Yubai. Elder Shifeng Rong? Yubai was slightly surprised at this answer. When the 2 had started to fight, he had already noticed. He hadn't detected anything in the first sword energy, but had been shocked that a Ling plant farmer could send out a sword energy. When he noticed the gold sword ring on Zuomo's hand, did he understand? At that time, he had prepared to wade in. Tianyu Jia was a classical minor Jia, primarily composed of sword cultivators. Xiuzha like Ling plant famers were a very rare resource. Not just Dongfu, but in almost all the primary towns of Tianyu Jia, there were prohibitions that protected production cultivators like Ling plant farmers. But just at that moment, Zuomo sent out the second sword energy. Yubai's eyes were very skilled and saw it clearly. The first sword energy only had a little sword energy, not enough to be of significance. But the sword essence in the second sword energy was very similar to Wukong Sword Sect's Ice Dragon Sword, Xian Yan's sword essence. Wukong Sword Sect's sudden rise had attracted everyone's eyes. And as the true ruler of Dongfu, Tian Songzi naturally would pay more attention. Yubai was the core disciple of Tian Songzi, and he knew much more about Wukong Sword Sect than normal people. The apparition when Wei Xing entered Juji had alerted Tian Songzi. That night, Yubai had accompanied his master to investigate. He had personally seen with his own eyes that sword energy that rose into the heavens at Wei Xing's Juji, and had never been so shocked. And the scene when Xian Yan's sword had turned into a dragon made his mouth wide, and unable to forget. His talents were exceptional, and the scope of his eyes far surpassed others in his generation. In the area around Dongfu, the people who could rank with him could be counted on the fingers. But in one night 2 successive blows, it created a great interest in him to the low-key sect of Wukong Sword Sect. He couldn't help closely examining Zuomo. From the beginning, the expression on Zuomo's face had never changed. Yubai didn't mind that. He had met countless unique individuals. Those that had strength always had some unique qualities. What made him shocked was Zuomo's age and cultivation. It wasn't high but low. It was very hard to estimate the age of cultivators, but a general decision could be made from the eyes, the manner of speech and conduct. The age of the Wukong Sword Sect disciple definitely wasn't high. Such an age, it was common to see a cultivation of lianqi. So young, such low cultivation, yet he could comprehend sword essence. This made Yubai very surprised. The sword essence carried in the second sword energy had been in a fledgling stage. The white mist surrounding the sword energy easily confused others. That wasn't mist that was caused by the coldness of the sword energy. In reality, it was composed of large numbers of even smaller sword essences. These scattered sword essences were far from complete like Xan Yan's sword essence, but this lianqi disciple was able to control them in a certain range. That wasn't easy to do. Yubai almost couldn't believe it. He always had been confident in his own talents. But seeing this zombie-like disciple, he felt that he didn't know what to say. When he first comprehended sword essence, he had been in the middle stages of Zhuji. He had sat quietly in his master's sword stove for more than 30 days, before he had some understandings. Even more, the jade metal of a ling plant farmer wasn't easy to get. Yubai had grown up in Dongfu, and knew very well of the difficulty. Another strong entity had come out of Wukong's sword sect. Even if his cultivation right now wasn't high, but his future was limitless. Wukong's sword sect, already mysterious in Yubai's mind, became even more mysterious. Give my greetings to Elder Shifeng Rong. Yubai warmly gave a bow. Noticing the alertness in Zuomo's eyes, he was a proud person, and his desire to form a relationship instantly faded. Dongfu might protect ling plant farmers, but you have to be careful and not have bad relationships with others. Finishing, he raised his hands and floated away. Zuomo's heart instantly landed back. He had already prepared to be injured, and hadn't thought he would be safe. Even he found it wondrous. Fu Jin wasn't seriously harmed, and firmly refused the jingsure that Zuomo handed over. This crisis changed the relationship between the two. Zuomo didn't like Yubai, but was very happy to interact with Fu Jin. Everyone was little people. Fu Jin was the local snakehead here. He was clear to what each place was selling. In 2 hours, he managed to help Zuomo buy everything he needed. It was a giant bag of a variety of seeds of ling herbs and grasses. 30 pieces of jingsure were completely spent by Zuomo taking the things he brought. He bid farewell to Fu Jin, and sat on the gray-beaked goose straight back to Wukong Mountain. He had decided that he definitely wouldn't leave the mountain before he entered Zhuji. He was still scared about what happened today. He and Dongqi sword sect were now at odds. If he encountered Dongqi disciples again, it wouldn't end well for him. To have such good luck as today every time, that was a dream. Dongfu wasn't some safe place. Chapter 38 Fragrant Ginger Yard. Zuomo needed to carefully plan out the 20 mu of ling fields. He had very little money in his hands, and couldn't buy many of the ling herb seeds. Following the conclusions that Elder Wei Nan had made from his experiences, what he picked were species that had a high-quality price ratio. To guarantee his profits, Zuomo had attentively researched the present market before taking all his bags with him to the mountain. But he couldn't start seeding it immediately. Up until now, he only had experience planting ling grains. Any kind of ling plant had different needs and concerns. Thankfully, Elder Wei Nan had detailed descriptions in the jade sticks, and he didn't need to experiment for himself. Studying the jade sticks, laboring over embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation. Other than that, he needed to care for the ling fields in Cold Mist Valley. He was extremely busy every day, his feet almost not touching the ground. When he had studied pretty much all the jade sticks, he started to prepare the initial work. Luckily, they were all somewhat common ling herbs and grasses, and didn't need anything rare or expensive. Otherwise, he could only just stare at it. I'm very poor, I'm very poor, I'm very poor. Humming a tune, Zuomo directed the mud-turning earthworm to plow the ling fields and seeded out the ling herbs and grasses he had brought. After a few days, some sprouts had appeared in the 20 mu. The tender greens carried Zuomo's hopes. Zuomo could finally slow down. Even he almost couldn't stand the amount of labor these past days. After planting down all the seeds, the labor required was instantly halved. He finally had the time to cultivate. This was why Sword Shio never liked cultivating any kind of livelihood spell. Practicing any spell required large amounts of time and energy. For sword cultivators, they only focused on the sword. This was enough for them to have unrivaled attack strength. This was also why, in all the Xiuzha, in one-on-one, Sword Xiu had the greatest power. Of course, the actual situation would be complicated. There were many factors that could affect the fight between two Xiuzha. It was all tangled and complicated, like cultivation, talismans, seal formations, scriptures, etc. Zuemo didn't need to think about these things. At least, before he entered Juji, he didn't need to consider it. For him, what was most important at present was Juji. After that was the 5 basic 5 elements spells. This would directly influences how much he would earn. He gave up 10 principal scripture. To try to rely on that to enter Juji, it was a dream. Embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation became his only choice. He cultivated it, as though it was a Ling energy scripture. After Juji, the sect would pass on new scriptures. By then he would have more choices. This period of time was extremely busy, so busy he forgot the existence of Pu Yao. It was only now that he suddenly remembered Pu Yao, and decided to take a look in his consciousness. Entering the sea of consciousness, he stared with wide eyes and mouth. Compared to before, the area of his consciousness was several times its previous size. This wasn't surprising to him because his spiritual power had increased greatly. He had already found that whenever his spiritual power increased, the size of his sea of consciousness would increase as well. What shocked him was a river. At some unknown time, a new edition of a river had appeared in his consciousness. A silvery shining river. The surface wasn't broad, but it was abnormally straight. It followed the median line of the consciousness, and divided the consciousness in two. When Zuemo came near, he was surprised to find that it wasn't water in the river, but countless large and small icicles. The light reflected through the icicles, and created the silvery light. And when the countless icicles reflected the light at the same time, the bright light was enough to make the consciousness brighter. They slowly moved up and down like the movement of the tide. Layers of silver light flashed past like a secluded and deeply asleep ice dragon. On the two shores were concentrated red flames. These red flames were like a red water plant that grew beside the rivers. In the sky above his head, that star was even brighter. Neither the roaring flames nor the shining ice river could block its light. In the sea of flames on the edge of the river, under the star, a gravestone was shrouded in black clouds and Pu Yao sat silently on it, listening to the sound tablet. Zuemo was completely stunned by the scene. The sea of consciousness was very calm, only the sound of the sound tablet drifting. The dark red flames danced, like the most seductive dancers twisting their waists. The slowly flowing ice river was like a sword, cold and awe-inspiring. The star was mysterious and profound. All of this created an extremely harmonious picture, and gave him a peerless shock. A beat later, Zuemo's mind refocused. He still wasn't clear what the sea of flames and the star was, but this ice river was like the tidal icicle sword essence that he had comprehended. About this point he was very certain, because from what he saw, flowing in the river wasn't icicles, but countless sword essences. This ice river would have formed exactly in this period of time. He felt that there was some faint connection, but no matter how hard he thought, he couldn't catch it. The flames and the star had appeared very early. They must be related to embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation. The time that the star appeared was when he had completed one breath. Did it represent one breath? What about the red flames? He wanted to ask Pu Yao, but he also knew that Pu Yao definitely wouldn't answer. Oh, of course, if there was Jingshi, that was a whole different matter. Zuemo didn't disturb Pu Yao, and left the consciousness. When Zuemo disappeared from the consciousness, Pu Yao opened his eye. In his blood-red eye was panic. Even though he was at the 9th level of Lianqi, but there was still a distance before reaching Juji. The amount of Ling energy needed for Lianqi 9th level was much greater than the previous levels. Zuemo wasn't impatient. With the help of a high-grade Ling vein, if he still couldn't enter Juji, he didn't need to cultivate anymore. He could feel that the increase in his Ling energy was very fast. The fire dragon grass had been moved into Zuemo's own fields. The sunlight in West Wind Valley was abundant, and more suitable to the growth of the fire dragon grass. Just like normal, Zuemo stood in front of the fire dragon grass. He cycled his Ling energy, his two hands moving quickly. It was art of crimson flame. After practicing finger movements in the water, the nimbleness of his pair of hands were much stronger than before. The art of crimson flame, with its simpler hand movements, was much easier for him to cast. A thin faint gold light dropped from the sky, past those Zuomo's hands, and was guided onto the fire dragon grass. Art of crimson flame could concentrate the essence of pure yang. It was very beneficial to plants that were yang. Zuomo didn't move, appearing like a stone person. The crucial factors of art of crimson flame were endurance and a peaceful mind. This wasn't a problem for Zuomo. After receiving the jade medal, he found that he had walked an indirect road. If he had picked art of crimson flame in the beginning, he would have gotten the jade medal earlier. However, there wasn't a deficiency that was for nothing. Since he could do art of flora, the most difficult of the 5 spells, the other spells were easily achieved. Time passed little by little. The strand of pale gold light that came from the sky turned slightly darker. A layer of light gold appeared on Zuomo's hands as though gold was plated onto them. The leaves of the fire dragon grass became even brighter and fresher, vitality pouring from the entire plant. After persisting for an hour, he finally stopped. His 2 hands moved, and that thin gold strand instantly disappeared. He inspected the fire dragon grass and was very satisfied. Art of crimson flame was extremely good for yang plants. All plants were divided into yin or yang. Zuomo also divided his own ling fields into 2. The parts with more sunlight, he used to plant yang plants. The parts that were shadier and had more moisture, he used to grow yin plants. Zuomo prepared to cast art of earth energy. Each day, he would cast a variety of spells on these plants. This was a duty that he had to complete every day. He didn't know if it was that he had used it too much, but art of crimson flame and art of earth energy quickly entered the 3rd level without any of the difficulty that came with the breakthroughs of the other 3 spells. Afterwards, he had thought and then understood. Most of the credit had to go to embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation. His spirit was much stronger than before. And no matter if it was the calm mind of art of crimson flame, or the communication and perception of art of earth energy, it was all tightly linked to the spirit. Suddenly a purple light landed beside his hand from the sky. A purple flying sword the length of his middle finger suddenly appeared next to his hand. Flying sword message? Zuomo turned to look around. Seeing that no one else was around, he then was certain it was for him. He carefully reached for the flying sword. The moment his finger touched the flying sword, a voice sounded inside his mind. Come to Fragrant Ginger Yard at 3. It was his master Shifengrong's voice. Zuomo's heart calmed down. Previously, he had been tortured to death by that pink paper crane, and he had finally received a break. The pitiful Zuomo. His nerves had become very fragile and suspicious of these kinds of things. These last few days, his master hadn't sought him out. It must have been given him time to get settled. Zuomo was very excited. Master's proficiency in the area of dan making was very deep, and according to Li Yingfeng Shiji, the dan that master made, it was always easy to sell. In the previous times that master had spent traveling outside, the income of the sect had been significantly impacted. And according to the experiences of Elder Wei Nan recorded in the Jade Stick, making dan was a faster way to make jingsher than farming. Exactly at 3, Zuomo arrived at Fragrant Ginger Yard. This was the first time he had come to Fragrant Ginger Yard. Entering the gate, he saw many female disciples at work. Some were drying ling herbs, some were sorting, others had ling energy on their hands as they ground up ling herbs. In this large yard, there were more than 40 female disciples at work. Seeing Zuomo, all these female disciples all stopped what they were doing. Shixiang, Shixiang. They all bowed in greeting and surreptitiously examined the Shixiang. The news that 4th Shirgu had received a male disciple had spread through Fragrant Ginger Yard very early on. This crowd of female disciples already had a good handle on Zuomo's background. What made them feel comforted was that Zuomo had once helped the female disciples at the Eastern Peak that were responsible for the animals, and wasn't one to harass others. They were all outer sect female disciples, and couldn't really count as Shifengrong's disciples. Compared to Zuomo, Their status was very far off and didn't dare offend him. Zuomo frantically gave a bow in return. Seeing Zuomo's embarrassed state, laughter sounded among the female disciples. The front female disciple instantly turned her head, looking in dissatisfaction at the female disciples who were laughing. The laughter instantly stopped. "Come in." Master's voice came from the inner yard, coincidentally releasing Zuomo from his predicament. He fled away. Chapter 39. Starting making Dan. From today onwards, you will learn how to make Dan with me. The job this month is very simple. 5 fasting pills, doesn't matter what grade they are. Give them to me by the end of the month, Shifeng Rong coldly said. I have prepared 10 portions of ingredients for you. If there isn't enough, buy more yourself. The method to make fasting pills is in the study. You can read all the jade sticks in the study. Those that are over your cultivation, you won't be able to see. Everything is in the room in the west wing. In the future, that would be your Dan making room. Alright, you can go. Finishing, Shifeng Rong turned and entered her Dan making room. With a bang, the Dan room was shut tightly. Zuomo dumbly stood. This was called learning Dan making with his master? He turned to look at the surroundings. Empty. Not a single person. Zuomo grimaced. Why did he only ever encounter these kind of people? It was like this when he learned things from Pu Yao. There were never any explanations. And this master was even more extreme. Not just throwing him to the side, she also stipulated how much he had to make. When Zuomo went into the study, he stared dumbly. How to find the recipe? In the study, there floated hundreds of jade sticks in different shapes and colors. They were like a group of mischievous children, drifting to and fro in the study. There was an energy whirlpool of various colors around each jade stick. It was these whirlpools that carried the jade sticks in flight. Fasting pill. After musing for a long moment, Zuomo shouted helplessly. The jade sticks unconcernedly floated about, not responding. That way wasn't right. But there wasn't anything else in the room. Zuomo scratched hard at his head. He was at his wit's end. Maybe he needed to use his consciousness? After hesitating for a while, he reached out with his consciousness. When his consciousness touched the energy whirlpool around a jade stick, something instantly flooded into his head. Energy diagrams of Ling herbs. Authored by Dongming Sanren, Eye of Little Lingjia. Includes more than 400 Ling herb energy diagrams. Zuomo's mind instantly jumped. His consciousness going to touch all the other jade sticks. The information from each jade stick was released inside his mind. Very quickly, he found inside one jade stick the method to make fasting pills. This jade stick had in total the recipe for 3 different basic Dan. Fasting pill was the most basic Dan. Its use was very simple, to satisfy hunger. Using it would guarantee a long time without hunger. It counted as a type of useful Dan. His consciousness locked onto this jade stick, and the jade stick automatically flew in front of him. Picking up the jade stick, he poured Ling energy in, and the recipe to make fasting pills was revealed in his mind. And then, the pitiful Zuomo could only stare dumbly again. Monarch Pakima leaves, subject yellow stone, 3x3 flowing fire, cauldron energy sinking to bottom. Zuomo recognized every character. However, if he put the characters together, it was like he was in a thick mist, completely lost. Calm, he had to be calm. Zuomo furiously told his frantic self. He had always assumed that when he became an inner sect disciple, it meant that his hard days had come to an end, and his good days were coming. But now he knew he was wrong, extremely wrong. He had only jumped from one hole to an even deeper hole. He wanted to cry because he had willingly jumped, tried everything to jump in. He had thought his previous days were hard, because no one was there to guide him. But now that he became an inner sect disciple, had a master, what was the difference? After a long moment, and then his emotions steadied. He was completely disregarded by his master. Zuomo's stubbornness came on. Wasn't it just a fasting pill? Wasn't it just making Dan? Wasn't it just not being taught? After half a day's worth of effort, he had read every single jade stick in the room. The total amount was 517 jade sticks. And what he could see were only 21 of them. The 21 jade sticks that he had picked out were all floating in front of him. Fire Cloud Dan chapter. Not what he wanted, thrown to one side. Blue Ice Dan chapter, no, thrown to one side. Vaporized Dan chapter, thrown. Only when he saw basics of making Dan did Zhuemo's mind become alert. He grabbed it and brought it over. This was what he wanted. As though he was starving, he read basics of making Dan. He quickly became enraptured. The contents inside the jade stick were extremely new to him. A completely new world for him to explore. There weren't any complex contents inside basics of making Dan. Everything was some of the basic fundamentals of making Dan, like the matching of herbs, the usage of the cauldron, how to control the fire, etc., etc. When he raised his head, he saw that the sky had darkened. Unknowingly, he had stayed for a number of hours in the study. Exhaling a breath, he stood up and moved his sore neck and legs. His eyes were still slightly dull. He was still thinking. Basics of making Dan wasn't a high-grade jade stick, but the details of the contents weren't anything that could be brought on the market. Having the experiences of being an outer sect disciple, Zhuemo deeply understood the value in this opportunity. As to whether his master would teach him, it had been thrown to the back of his head. It was like he had found treasure, as he repeatedly started to read again. The following days, he spent soaking in knowledge at the study. Any jade stick that he could read, he didn't miss a single one of them. They might be useful in the future. Putting in some effort now, he didn't need to worry in the future. If he converted these jade sticks into Jingshi, it was enough to buy 10 Zhuemo. If there was one day when he was in poverty, he could sell the contents of the jade sticks for Jingshi. In the study, Zhuemo snickered. After memorizing the jade sticks until he was dizzy, Zhuemo finally managed to remember the entire contents of the 21 jade sticks. Only now did he remember the Dan room in the right wing was going to be for him, and excitedly ran into the right wing. What was most eye-catching in the room was a copper cauldron in the middle of the room, about 2 people tall, 3 round bellies protruding out, and several mats laid around it. There were a few tables against the wall with things piled up on it. The 10 portions of materials that Master had prepared for him were also there. Zhuemo circled around the Dan-making cauldron muttering, "So stingy. Don't just look at the size of the thing, but in reality, it was only a first-grade cauldron." The most important part of a cauldron was the Li-2 fire seal formation. Beside the body of the cauldron, there was a yin-yang 8 trigrams plate, pouring Ling energy in that could control the Li fire seal formation. Controlling the fire was the most important step in the process of making Dan. Like the 3x3 of flowing fire, 3x3 meant vertical 3, horizontal 3, and flowing fire was a very special kind of fire. Its main flame would roll along the channels. Zhuemo put his hands on the 8 trigrams plate and added Ling energy. As expected, a ball of fire lit up at the bottom of the cauldron. According to the method recorded in Basics of Making Dan, he carefully controlled the Li fire seal formation. The Li fire seal formation in a first-grade cauldron wasn't some high-end thing, and only had 6 transformations. Zhuemo quickly familiarized himself with the process. As he played around with the flame, Zhuemo suddenly felt that the feeling of controlling fire was very similar to him casting Art of Crimson Flame. The 5 basic spells of a Ling plant farmer belong to the 5 elements in yin-yang. Supposedly, Ling plant farmers believed that all things in the world were either yin or yang, and belonged to the 5 elements. Art of Crimson Flame belonged to fire in the 5 basic element spells. Speaking from that perspective, the two were connected. However, while the 5 elements in yin-yang had once been a popular path, but as sword cultivators rose, they gradually became a separate system, and most practitioners were roaming cultivators. Whether making Dan had similarities to Ling plant farmers, Zhuemo wasn't clear. But if sword essence could merge with Art of Aged Gold, he wouldn't be surprised at a connection between controlling fire and Art of Crimson Flame. The Art of Crimson Flame that he had brought was very rough. Learning it to the 3rd level was already at the extreme limit. There were no instructions for anything further. What he could study were only the first 3 levels. Closing his eyes, his 2 hands were spread on the 8 trigrams plate on the wall of the cauldron. He carefully experienced the subtle aspects of the Li fire seal formation. After a long time, he didn't have any breakthroughs. He had the feeling that those 2 could be combined together, but no matter how he changed it, there was no reaction. With no other solution, he temporarily put the thought to the side. In the area of dam making, he was the greenest of the green. It was too early to start discussing inventions. He should obediently make the fasting pills. Otherwise, if he couldn't give out 5 at the end of the month, he didn't know how his cold-faced master would punish him. The method for making fasting pills, he remembered it, but what he was lacking was actual experience. There were 10 portions of materials piled on the table. They had all been treated. One of the jobs of the female disciples in the yard was to simply treat all kinds of medicines. Fasting pills were the most basic dan, and naturally didn't have very complicated preparations. Carefully putting each type of material in the cauldron according to the ratio, Swaemo sat down facing the cauldron. He sorted out his mind, his 2 hands on the 8 trigrams, and sent Ling energy in. A light red light came out of the bottom of the cauldron. Swaemo carefully and nervously manipulated the Ling energy. 2 hours passed. A fine layer of sweat appeared on Swaemo's forehead. He felt it was becoming difficult. It was extremely laborious to continuously input in Ling energy steadily for a long time. Damn it! 2 hours had passed, but the ingredients had just seemed to start combining together. Based on the progress, if it didn't take a few hours, he guessed it was hopeless. Thinking that he had to continue to maintain this level of Ling energy for long hours, Swaemo felt that it was going to be trouble. After another 2 hours, sweat poured down his back. Suddenly, his Ling energy became unstable. Poof! A black wisp of smoke came out of the cauldron. A burnt smell filled the room. Huff, huff, huff. Having no time to be angry, Swaemo took back his Ling energy and sat on the floor as he panted. His entire body was soaked in sweat. One factor was exhaustion from long-term Ling energy output. Another was that he was very close to the cauldron. The fire inside the cauldron cooked him like a cooked shrimp, body completely red. He didn't immediately start making dan a second time. He struggled up and climbed onto the gray-beaked goose to return to West Wind Valley. It was lucky that he was an inner sect disciple and could ride a steed inside the mountain. He hadn't felt it a moment ago, but lying on the back of the gray-beaked goose, he felt weak all over, not willing to raise even a finger. He had never felt such deep exhaustion like today. Fighting was gathering up all the strength in the body at one, and making dan was like spinning silk from cocoons. Bit by bit, until it wrung out the last bit of Ling energy from the body. Even if his Ling energy wasn't weak now, but facing such intense Ling energy output, he couldn't bear it. And if he was the slightest bit inattentiveness, all the effort before were completely ruined. Swaemo sighed in grief inside. From his perspective, as expected, any method that easily earned Jingshur, none of them were simple. Jingshur wasn't easy to earn? Title for a roaming xiao. One of the 8 trigrams Li represents fire. Chapter 48. On top of the mat inside the stone room, Swaemo serenely mediated motionless. Through the 24th point of the governing, the 17th point of the conception, and the 1st point of the kidney vessels, thick Ling energy entered his body. It especially entered from the governing vessel point. When the Ling energy entered, it had a slightly cool feeling, extremely pleasant. After Swaemo had completed one breath, his breathing through the mouth and nose was much less important. Right now he had only opened 3 points. If he could reach 10 breaths, not only just all 361 points would be opened, all the pores in his body would be unblocked, and he would breathe with the world. Of course, for him at the moment, that was very far away. His consciousness had increased, but up until now, he hadn't found any uses for spiritual power. What he needed now was Ling energy, continuous accumulating Ling energy, in hopes of entering Zhuji soon. When he woke up from the mediation, Swaemo's breath shot out like an arrow. How was Shixiang doing in the sword cave? The thought popped suddenly into Swaemo's mind. In reality, he was very envious about the road that Shixiang had picked. It only needed to pay attention to one matter. However, he was clear enough to realize that Shixiang's road wasn't suited for him. So he might be envious, but he would keep doing what he needed to do. He always felt that he didn't have too much talent in the area of the sword. If it wasn't for Pu Yao's existence, not just getting a sword essence, But it was impossible to do what Xixiang was doing. His talents laid in the 5 elements. Other than Art of Aged Gold, which had been helped by Pu Yao, he had learned the other 4 spells on his own. So he was more enthusiastic about 5 elements spells. Sometimes he would think, had he once been a roaming Xiao before? Only roaming Xiao liked 5 elements spells. However, even if he had been a roaming Xiao, he must have been a silent and unknown Xiao living in the lowest classes. But if that was the case, why was his appearance changed and mind erased? He unconsciously tightened his fist. Carefully retreating out of the stone cavern, he walked to the opening. The sunlight outside made his eyes squint. The warm sunlight made Zuomo's mood unintentionally better. Walking to the Ling fields and seeing the vigorous Ling herbs, his mood became even better. A Ling plant farmer was the profession that was the easiest at showing the relationship between work and result. When you paid an effort and worked hard, the joy at the bountiful harvest made life seem full of hope. Even Old Black, who had a harsh life, smiled when it was harvest time. Zuomo calculated the time in his mind. The new cycle of Ling grains should be starting soon. His previous yard had been yielded to Old Black. Old Black had been yearning for that 5 mu of Ling fields for a long time. If it hadn't been for Old Black, he wouldn't have been introduced to Wei Xing Xixiang. With that connection there, his friendship with Old Black was naturally different. With nothing to do, Zuomo thought to go see him. However, he didn't find anyone at the yard. Zuomo guessed that Old Black had gone to the Ling fields and headed to the fields. As expected, he found Old Black in the fields. Also there was Guolu. However, the former Guolu Xixiang was now the present Guolu Shidi. That made him slightly unaccustomed. No matter the age or cultivation, outer sect disciples had to call inner sect disciples Xixiang or Shiji. This was the same in every sect. Old Black saw Zuomo and made a happy expression. Little Mo Gu. It seemed that Guolu's illness had healed. He wasn't familiar with Zuomo and reservedly gave a bow. Zua Xixiang. Zuomo felt extremely awkward being called Xixiang by 2 people whose ages far surpassed him. Thankfully, his face was frozen and nothing could be detected. Old Black's Ling grains are really well grown. Zuomo scanned the Ling fields and couldn't resist praising it. He calmly started a spell. Instantly a ball of clouds floated over, and the silver strands poured down continuously. Old Black instantly revealed a happy expression. Admiration appeared on Guolu's face. The 4th level of Little Art of Cloud and Rain. People rarely reached it. Guolu had been recovering on the sickbed in the previous months, but the big events that happened in the sect, he had heard them from Old Black. In 1 year, 3 outer sect disciples became inner sect disciples. The sect had never been so flourishing. All the outer sect disciples were greatly encouraged, and many of them became even more hard-working. Guolu attentively examined this young Xixiang. Little Zuomo Xixiang was the inner sect disciple with the lowest cultivation in the sect, a Lianqi disciple that hadn't entered Juji. But the genius of the little Xixiang had passed on. To be able to receive a spring sprout jade medal in Lianqi, Guolu had never heard of it. His best was Art of Aged Gold. He had worked hard these years but never could break through to the 3rd level. Looking at the little Xixiang who had already become a Ling plant farmer, his heart couldn't help moving. Thinking about it, he couldn't help but be envious of Old Black. No matter if it was Wei Xing Xixiang or Zuomo Xixiang, they all had good relationships with Old Black. The waters rose and the boat became high. Old Black was now extremely popular in the outer sect disciples. But Old Black was very down to earth and still planted his Ling grains. Because Guolu had been wounded last time when he had helped Old Black, and Old Black had taken care of him in the recovery, the 2 had a great relationship. This is 2 mud-turning earthworms. It doesn't have a great use, but it is useful in plowing fields. Zuomo handed both of them each a small bamboo tube. Sealed inside each tube was a mud-turning earthworm. He hadn't thought that Guolu would be present, but he had enough mud-turning earthworms. The 2 hurriedly gave their thanks. Guolu saw Zuomo moving to leave and after struggling and hesitating for a second, he couldn't resist speaking and at the very end, Little Xixiang, my Art of Aged Gold, has been stuck at the 2nd level. Please Xixiang, give some advice. Guolu would be deeply grateful. Zuemo was astounded but still stopped in his footsteps. He was respectful of this old farmer like Xixiang, who had stood up last time. Right now, his income didn't depend on things like making rain, so the two naturally didn't have any conflicts in interest. Quite the opposite. If Guolu could break into the third level of Art of Aged Gold, he could take on much of the pest problems in the sect for him. Thinking through all the possibilities, he decided to help Guolu. Killing worms is still killing. Gold's main purpose is to kill. This Art of Aged Gold belongs to the path of killing. How to kill? There are countless ways in this area. Adding on aged gold energy can transform in many ways. If other methods of killing could be added in, the matter is half solved already. Guolu listened attentively, afraid of losing even a word. When Zuemo finished, he was pinned to his spot, face deep in thought. Seeing the situation, Zuemo floated away. Leaving behind the Ling fields, he headed for the eastern peak. The recent changes made him felt that it was a different lifetime. The female disciples of the eastern peak had meant to rely on him. But who would have thought he would become an inner sect disciple? Usually, he wouldn't be able to care for them anymore. But since he received benefits from them, that the black gold worm had been their present, Zuemo decided to help them. When Xiaogua saw Zuemo, a surprised expression came onto her round apple face. She timidly said, "Xixiang." The gold-horned copper cow was still leisurely eating ling grass. Not paying any attention to Zuemo felt slightly helpless towards this little girl, especially the always timid expression on her face. Last time when he had fainted, the little girl had been afraid, but still persisted in protecting him. When he had heard of this from the others, he was very moved and felt that he owed her a favor. "What? Unhappy to see me?" Zuemo decided to tease the little girl. His face didn't have any expression in the first place. Adding on a slightly stern tone, it was quite frightening. Xiaogua instantly was frightened, her small head furiously shaking, mist rising in her large yes, her mouth hurriedly explaining, "No, no." Zuemo instantly realized if he continued, she would really cry. He instantly regretted his action. Wasn't this making trouble for himself? He hurriedly relaxed his tone. "All right. Coming this time, there's something to give to you." The mist in Xiaogua's eyes instantly stopped. She looked in puzzlement at Zuemo and asked timidly, "What thing?" "Xixiang. This is some sword scriptures. You take it in practice, and can pass it on to your other Shiji and Shimi." He handed 2 jade sticks over to the little girl. One of the sticks stored some basic sword moves that he had picked out from the jade stick that Wei Xing Xixiang had given him. At the same time, he took off the gold sword ring from his hand and handed that as well to her. "This is gold sword ring. It can store 3 sword energies. But you first need to learn a gold spell. One of the jade sticks has 5 elements spells inside. After practicing the Art of Aged Gold for a while, you can use this talisman." After explaining all this, Zuemo released a breath. This muddle-headed little girl always made his head hurt. The gold sword ring was not of great use to him now, and he had decided that before Zhuji, he definitely wouldn't leave the mountain. After Zhuji, if Master didn't give a flying sword, he could use Ice Crystal Sword. The power would be much greater than Gold Sword Ring, and that jade stick that contained the 5 elements spells wasn't useful for him anymore. He hadn't thought of giving Xiaogua that jade stick at first, but if she didn't cultivate a gold-attributed spell, it wasn't possible to use the Gold Sword Ring. As though the simple sword moves in Wei Xing Xixiang's jade stick. They were simple but useful. For Lianqi disciples, they were a pretty good method of protection. Female disciples, especially weaker outer sect female disciples, their circumstances would be harder than male disciples. Zuemo could not spare the attention to take care of them like before, and decided to pass these things on to them. In this case, if they met some Xiozha who wasn't too powerful, it wasn't as though they couldn't even counterattack. If they met a strong one, he had no solution neither. Luckily, the Dongqi sword sect disciple from last time had been expelled from Dongfu. He didn't need to worry about encountering that guy nearby. After handing over everything, Zuemo flipped up and landed onto the gray-beaked goose's back. He waved his hand at Xiaogua without turning his head back and floated off. Looking at the disappearing Zuemo, Xiaoguo's hands as they held the gold sword ring, and the jade sticks unconsciously tightened. Finishing all this, Zuoyamo felt that his body was much more relaxed and headed straight for fragrant ginger yard. He still needed to present 5 fasting pills at the end of the month. He didn't dare to offend his cold-faced master. If he didn't complete it, he would certain receive punishment. Entering the Dan room, he didn't start moving immediately. The materials were limited. If he really ruined all of the materials, in his penniless state, there was no place for him to buy more. In theory, with his present cultivation, making fasting pills shouldn't be hard. It really was the most basic Dan. Thinking for a long time, he felt that last time it was that he hadn't controlled the input of Ling energy properly, and wasted a lot of Ling energy, causing his Ling energy to not be enough. After thinking for a long time repeatedly, and entering mediation, he let the Ling energy recover to the best state. Then he started his second try. Chapter 41 Spiritual Power Bang. The smell of burnt materials once again rose out of the cauldron, spreading through the room. Zuoyamo gasped heavily, sweat running down his face like a stream. The second try was still a failure. This time, he had continued for 6 hours but still failed. Opening the cauldron, and looking at the black remnants inside, Zuoyamo's mood was terrible. He was as tired as a dead dog right now, and could only stare. He had always thought Dan making was a technical job, not a strength job. If even the fasting pills were this hard, then those high-grade Dan, wouldn't he kill himself in the process? He had a deeper understanding in the second try than the first. His previous deductions were not wrong. He was still too new to Dan making. In the process of adding Ling energy, he would waste too much Ling energy. If his cultivation was at Juji, this fasting pill wouldn't be hard. There would be plenty of excess Ling energy to waste. But to a Lianqi 9th level, just the slightest mistake, and the Ling energy wouldn't be enough. According to the method on the jade stick, the entire process only needed 10 hours. That meant that he had to make it through 10 hours at minimum. The difference between that and the present 6 hours was very large. Even though there was the Ling vein in the stone room, but increases in Ling energy was a slow process. It seemed he could only try to work on controlling Ling energy. After a while, Zuoyamo's breaths gradually steadied and his mind returned to clarity. He thought carefully. He wasn't weak in the area of controlling Ling energy. Little art of cloud and rain required a strong control of Ling energy. Even though he had strangely made his way onto the 4th level, but in the matter of controlling Ling energy, theoretically it shouldn't be a big problem. Mulling over it, Zuoyamo felt that he was still too unfamiliar with Dan making. If he had to familiarize himself, then how much material would that take? The 10 portions that he had, he didn't even know if it could last him until he was familiar. He most likely wouldn't be able to fulfill the quota of 5 fasting pills by the end of the month. Supposedly, when the heads took on new subordinates, they would always make a show of strength at the first interaction. Oh, was this the show of strength of his cold-faced master? He thought humorously. Returning to the little west wind yard, he wasn't in the mood to eat. After meditation and recovering Ling energy, he climbed onto the roof and continued to ponder the intricacies of Dan making. The moonlight flowed down like the water, gently illuminating the mountain valley. Beside Zuoyamo, the gray-beaked goose silently stood on the roof. Beside Zuoyamo's feet, the black gold worm climbed around. After reaching the 4th grade, its intelligence had greatly increased, and it constantly followed Zuoyamo around. Suddenly, Zuoyamo felt something was flying close. He couldn't help raising his head, and looked at the mouth of the valley. A pink little thousand crane spiraled down in the night. Zuoyamo instantly recovered from his shock at the top of the roof. He felt his skin prickle. Dan making was tossed far away. There was only one thought in his mind. Damn it, why did this cursed woman come again? Just like last time, the pink paper crane elegantly unfolded in front of Zuoyamo. Yi, have you missed me? Hee, I've missed ye. Looking at the paper floating in front of him, Zuoyamo had a strong impulse to kick it down Wukong Mountain. Calm, he needed to be calm. Suppressing the devious impulse inside, Zuoyamo spat out a stream of malicious swears and discontent. Damned woman! You won't die well. You're just bored and have nothing to do. You mental case. swearing for 10 minutes. Zuemo swore so much his throat was dry. The irritation in his heart decreased slightly. Looking at the pink paper that was still floating in place before him, Zuemo, who had a moment ago been full of righteous indignation, instantly became dejected. In helplessness, he grabbed the pink paper and jumped down off the roof. Finding a weasel bristle brush, he dipped it in cinnabar. What is it? After throwing the brush to one side, Zuemo messily folded the paper into a crane and threw it out the window. Even though he got rid of the crane, Zuemo still felt depressed. He really had no solution against the owner of the paper crane. He had never thought someone would be bored to such a degree. This bored crazy woman. But her power was much stronger than him. Just any discomfort, and the other would straightforwardly use brute force to suppress it. When G becomes strong, see how G will sort you out. Zuemo bared his teeth. Very quickly, another pink paper crane flew over. Don't be like this to me. I'm very hurt. Yi, what have you been doing recently? What a waste of words. Zuemo crisply made an evaluation, but still grudgingly picked up the brush. Making Dan. West Wind Valley, the paper cranes flew in and out. Ah, dam making. That's fun. I've never played it before. I only know how to fold paper cranes. You only know how to fold cranes? When Zuemo saw the words, his face instantly became black. He wrote back with the brush. Wrong. You also can draw flame exploding seals. Hehe, I'm really not that good at flame exploding seals. What I'm best at is a 36-chain flame exploding seal. Threat's menace. This definitely was a threat. Zuemo's fist cracked as it tightened. From his teeth he forced out. Go will endure. The reality was cruel. Under the threat of the other's 36-chain flame exploding seal, Zuemo could only swallow his anger and keep writing. Have to be a lady. A female fighting and killing isn't good. But I'm very much a lady. Hehe. I just like watching fireworks. My goal is 108 chain. Fireworks. Zuemo felt depressed. His fragile spirit was viciously struck again. The whole night, Zuemo basically had no time to think about Dan making. The pink paper cranes were like a relentless nightmare, forcing Zuemo to keep writing. Only when the sky lightened was he under the others. I'm going to be freed. Zuemo had been tormented to crippleness. He felt that it was even more tiring to reply to letters the whole night than making Dan the whole night. Bending to scoop some cold water, he washed his face. Then he came to the Ling fields. Different compared to the other spells, making rain was almost required every day. In a state of muddle-headedness, he casted Little Art of Cloud and Rain. The sounds of water falling started. His mind was floating far away. Little Art of Cloud and Rain was his most familiar spell. Even if he closed his eyes, he could still cast it. The Ling energy gathered at both of his hands. There was a connection between the ball of clouds and his two hands. The rain was very steady and continuous. He instinctively adjusted the Ling energy. He was too familiar with the spell. He didn't need to add Ling energy at every single spot. Wait. Zuemo was startled out of his daze. He realized he had a very important discovery. He didn't need to add Ling energy to every location. He indistinctly felt that he found the crucial point, and didn't dare to ignore it. He hurried and continued to think. Little Art of Cloud and Rain was his most skilled and most familiar spell. He was extremely familiar with every segment. He thought carefully, from starting with the finger motions of Little Art of Cloud and Rain, to concentrating the clouds, to the fall of rain. The amount of Ling energy for each step was different. Some parts, like the rain falling, it almost didn't need any Ling energy at all, just guidance. As he thought even further, Zuemo became excited, his drowsiness fading. If the process of Dan making was like casting a spell, then it should also have places that wouldn't consume Ling energy. As he mused to himself, Zuemo felt that it was very rational, and also felt that his actions of putting in a continuous flow of Ling energy was very stupid. Understanding the direction, then the next step was to find where in the process needed Ling energy, and what times could Ling energy be saved. This question sent him back into deep thought. He was very familiar with Little Art of Cloud and Rain, so he could find what places needed or didn't need Ling energy. However, he was unfamiliar with Dan making. To find the ways to save up Ling energy, he needed to become familiar with the entire process. Yet to familiarizing himself with the entire process, that meant using up large amounts of materials. Unfortunately, he didn't have any Jingshi left. The stone-faced Zhuemo grimaced inside. The question was once again difficult. Was the only way increasing Ling energy? That wasn't realistic. Embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation was only a scripture for increasing spiritual power. Suddenly his heart jumped. Spiritual power. Maybe he could try with spiritual power. As his mind increased in strength, his greatest change was becoming much more sensitive to everything in the surroundings. Like some of the high-level Jinji, before when he passed them, he wouldn't feel anything. But now he could detect the strong killing intent and danger embodied in them. How to use his consciousness was a question he had been puzzled by. Other than art of aged gold, he had no knowledge of how to use his consciousness. What embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation cultivated was the spirit. The increase in the Ling energy was just a side effect. After he cultivated embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation, the increase in his spirit far surpassed his progress in Ling energy. Maybe he should think about how to use the consciousness. Zhuemo felt that this might be the breakthrough point. Zhuemo spent the whole day casting the 5 spells in the Ling fields. But today, he didn't focus on casting the spells, but rather on using the consciousness to detect the entire process of casting. This method was extremely effective. Zhuemo was pleasantly surprised by his results. Each step, the change in flow of Ling energy each time, under the scan of the consciousness, it became clear as it never had been before. He could even feel the hair-thin Ling energy flowing. It seemed that he had a treasure mountain, but didn't know. Zhuemo was irritated. If he had known earlier to use the consciousness, his spells might have entered the 3rd level much earlier. The soul was peaceful, untainted, and serene. Under the guidance of his consciousness, he focused on making slight changes to each spell. He didn't let go of any change in the Ling energy. How to increase the effect, how to save on Ling energy, how to make it flow. He was like a stone mason, slowly performing changes on his work, slowly experimenting. He didn't know that in his sea of consciousness, the star became brighter than it had ever been, standing out in the darkness. The dancing red sea of flames was strangely quiet and motionless. Only the ice river was slowly flowing unaffected. On the gravestone shrouded in black clouds, Puyao raised his head. The corner of his mouth rose, cold like a blade. This is the person you chose? Looking at it now, your eyes are still this crappy. He closed his blood eye again, entering meditation. Chapter 42. Dan completed. Zhuemo held the fasting pill in front of him, his eyes filled with joy. This was his 4th try and he finally succeeded. The fasting pill was the size of a longan fruit. Its color was an attractive blue-green, with a delicate fragrance being emitted. Just the look made one unable to resist wanting to eat it. Fasting pills were mostly prepared for those cultivators who were in seclusion and who had the money. He didn't immediately start making a second one. The success of this fasting pill meant that his direction was correct. With that in the front, what he needed to think about now was the success rate. There were only 6 portions of ingredients left. At the very least, he needed to make 4 fasting pills. In other words, he could only fail 2 more times. In reality, on the 3rd try, he had almost succeeded. However, he slipped up at a small place and everything failed. His consciousness could help him detect the changes of the herbs inside the cauldron, and he could accordingly adjust his Ling energy. Spiritual power was really a good thing. Zhuemo thought blissfully. Other than Dan making, after he swept over the other spells with his consciousness and made adjustments, not only did his consumption of Ling energy go down, the effects also greatly improved. He did have a few fractions of self-awareness. Even though spiritual power was amazing, but his own experience and knowledge was extremely limited. Even with the help of his spiritual power, the changes he could make were limited. But even those minor changes were very effective. He mused that he should go to the records of the sect to take a look and see if he could find any jade sticks about this area. He was an inner sect disciple now. It would be dumb if he didn't seek out some benefits for himself, ending up with a cold-faced master who couldn't be relied upon. It was more realistic to rely on himself. Sword cultivators might prioritize Ling energy and not spiritual power. But Zhuo believed what Wukong's sword sect had accumulated over the years definitely surpassed his aimless fumbles. Of course, that was for the future. Right now he had many things to work on. Other than dan making, taking care of the Ling fields was also an important job. Even more, for him who had no money at the moment, earning Jingshi was the question he must consider at the present. It had been a while since those Ling grass and herbs had been planted. Some were nearing the harvest time. How to sell them off was also a headache for him. Before he entered Juji, he didn't want to go outside the gates of the mountain. Suddenly remembering Master had said if he didn't have enough materials, he had to use his own Jingshi to buy. Did that mean that the sect's materials could be brought? Then did that mean he could sell them? Zhuo walked out of his dan room. In the yard, a crowd of female disciples worked hard at preparing all kinds of herbs. Scanning around, Zhuo's gaze landed on a female disciple. He remembered clearly that the first day he arrived, she was the first to greet him. She seemed to be quite authoritative among this group of female disciples. She was dressed in cotton cloth and an apron, no makeup on, sweat beading her forehead. This shimmy, Zhuo went to greet her. Even though his age was most likely smaller than the other, but due to the rules of the sect, he didn't dare to overstep. She saw Zhuo and hurriedly stood. Zhuo, I've just gotten here, and do not know many of the rules in the yard. Master is focused on making dan, so I can only trouble shimmy. Zhuo said warmly, but it was a pity that his face was frozen, and it looked slightly frightening. After the initial panic, the female disciples quickly calmed down and said, Xixiang is too polite. What is Xixiang's question? Zhuo asked her his question. This female disciple brushed away the hair in front of her head and smiled. Xixiang might not know, but all the herbs in this yard belong to the sect. Other than a certain amount that can be withdrawn, all others need people to pay with Jingshi. But the price is 2/10 lower than the market price. Xixiang is a Ling plant farmer. If you have Ling plants and grasses, you can sell them to this yard. The purchase price of normal herbs are about 2/10 lower than the market price, but other than Jingshi, Xixiang will receive contribution points to exchange for scriptures and other things. If it is rare and valuable Ling herbs and grasses, our sect's purchase price is the same as the market. In the future, when Xixiang becomes accomplished at dan making, the sect can help sell the dan that Xixiang makes. Our sect's Yin Lishirshu is skilled at business, and usually can sell them for a good price. He only takes 2/10 as a commission. But like before, other than Jingshi, Xixiang can receive contribution points. Finishing, she handed Zhuo a jade stick. The price of Ling grasses and herbs will change each month. Yin Lishirshu will order someone to make it into a jade stick. This is the inventory list of the prices for this month of Ling herbs. Zhuo took it and gave his thanks. Xixiang doesn't have to be too polite. Shimmy is Su Qing, and the first seat of this yard's outer sect disciples. In the future, Xixiang, please take care of me. If Xixiang has any questions, come find me. You can also find me if you need to purchase any materials. Su Qing said respectfully. Thanks, Shimmy. Zhuo said gratefully. Taking the list, Zhuo went back to the dan room and studied the list. He calculated and found the cost of the raw materials for the fasting pill was about 3 pieces of second-grade Jingshi, and its price was only half a second-grade Jingshi over the cost of the materials. If the success rate was accounted for, there was basically no profit. As expected, it was basically impossible to rely on low-level dan to make money. It really was just practice. But that was normal. If fasting pills were really that profitable, then countless people would be breaking their heads for a chance to learn how to make dan. In the following days, Zhuo continued to make fasting pills. In the process, he had failed once, but as he became more familiar, it took a lot less effort. 10 portions of materials, it made 6 fasting pills. This kind of result could only be called just passable. There was nothing that was worth being proud of. Other than leaving behind the 5 pills, the last one he sold to Su Qing, and received 3 pieces of second-grade Jingshi. Adding on that he would have an allowance of 20 pieces of second-grade Jingshi, he finally wasn't penniless. In the Ling fields of West Wind Valley, Zhuo carefully examined each stalk of Ling herbs and grass. In the jade sticks of Elder Wei Nan, there had been detailed introductions of these herbs and the methods of cultivating them that he had found. Like snowy foxtail grass, it was snowy white and soft, named for its foxtail-like shape. Its biggest use was to make a famous kind of paper, snowy fox paper. Snowy fox paper was soft and pure white, extremely well suited for making paper seals. Paper was a kind of widespread material, other than all kinds of paper cranes. It was an essential ingredient in making seal curses and seal soldiers. But the cultivation of snowy foxtail grass wasn't easy as its growth was slow, especially for snowy foxtail grass, which was above 3rd grade. The price was never low. Only 3rd grade snowy foxtail grass could be used to manufacture 4th grade snowy fox paper. Elder Wei Nan had discovered a method for cultivating snowy foxtail grass. The most effective way was to plant it with butterfly grass. Butterfly grass was an extremely common kind of ling grass. Only the most docile and hardy ling beasts would eat it. Basically, no one would plant it. But if butterfly grass and snowy foxtail grass were planted together, the growth speed of snowy foxtail grass would increase, and the blue-purple butterfly grass would become a rare sky blue. This sky blue butterfly grass was deeply favored by all kinds of ling beasts, especially high-grade ling beasts. The price wasn't low. Many times, Zuemo couldn't help but be in awe of Elder Wei Nan, who he had never met. In Elder Wei Nan's jade sticks, there wasn't any profound scriptures, but useful techniques like this one were countless. Like the method of growing butterfly grass and snowy foxtail grass together. He felt that even the most experienced and powerful ling plant farmers wouldn't have thought of it. Maybe it was because Elder Wei Nan didn't have very high cultivation, so he would spend so much effort studying those things. Every day, Zuemo would cast the spells of a ling plant farmer on the plants in the ling fields. The amount of work was much greater than he had imagined, but he had endured. Over time, he had gotten used to it. He kept on cultivating, embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation, each day in the rock room. In the past, he hadn't known the many uses of spiritual energy, and had more or less been inattentive. Now that he had seen the effects, he was much more focused. In a reversal of the past, he actually was not in a hurry to enter Zhuji anymore. His spiritual power was much stronger than before, but there was a lot of room for him to improve. With the help of the ling vein, the progress of the ling energy in his body was faster than his estimations. Zhuji wasn't far away. He had a premonition. Dongfu Hall. Dongfu Hall was the residence of the master of Dongfu. It had been constructed for Dongfu Xianren, and had been used since then. It took up the biggest secret paradise in Dongfu, and it was Dongfu's one true secret paradise. The so-called secret paradises that were sold on the market were only places with slightly more abundant ling energy, and couldn't be really considered a secret paradise. Yu Bai slowly woke up from his meditation, satisfaction gleaming in his warm eyes. The density of ling energy in Dongfu Hall was multiple times what it was outside. The fact that he could become the leader of the younger generation of Dongfu was in large part due to this point. The effects of his daily meditation was 2 or 3 times what other people had. After accumulating over the years, this kind of advantage would increasingly become greater. Master. Seeing Master, he hurriedly stood. How have you been feeling recently? Tian Songzi asked as he smiled harmoniously. Tian Songzi was wearing the robes of a Taoist, a knot on his head, extremely carefree. Relatively stable, but still far from becoming Jin Dan. No hurry, no hurry. Tian Songzi waved his hand. You are still young, don't rush. Becoming Jin Dan is a process. Did you hear the news about the sword test conference? Yu Bai paused. Does Master want this disciple to attend the sword test conference? Even though he had a shining reputation in Dongfu, but he really didn't much confidence in attending the sword test conference, which was a large-scale completion for the entire Kunlun Jing. And from what he had seen, Master never really cared about worldly rewards, so why would he suddenly become interested in the sword test conference? Tian Songzi smiled, answering. Wait for me to finish. The internal happenings of the sword test conference are layered, but we don't have to touch that dirty water. His expression became severe, his gaze worried, and said solemnly, I received news that 2/3 of Bloody Sky Metropolis has already landed in the hands of Yaomo. Ah, Yubai paled in shock. How could that be so? Yaomo are starting to recover their strength. Tian Songzi sighed. 3,000 years have passed. Yaomo recuperated and have adapted. Would they be satisfied being suppressed? Yubai's expression was incomparably bad. He knew what this meant. The situation in the future is hard to predict. My Dongfu needs to prepare early. Tian Songzi said heavily. I will host a Dongfu sword test conference in hopes of finding some potential talents. When the nest is being attacked, will there be unharmed eggs? I will tell the other sections. Right now, it has to be a united front in order to fight for a chance at survival. Yubai was silent. A beat later he said, I'm afraid Master will put in the effort but not be thanked. Do within the limits, and depend on the heavens. Tian Songzi sighed and waved his hand. Go and create a list of youths that should be taken note of. Yes. Yubai bowed and retreated with a worried expression. Chapter 43 First grade Lingdan, his cold-faced master, seemed to have no intentions of wanting to come out of her Dan room. With Jingshi on his hands, Zuomo decided to start working on his Dan-making skills. At the very least, for basic Dan like fasting pills, he shouldn't have problems such as the efficiency rate. Buying the materials from Suqing Shimi, Zuomo started to furiously practice making fasting pills. His income and costs basically was even. The biggest question Zuomo faced was how to avoid failure. Failing once meant losing 3 pieces of second-grade Jingshi. His level of familiarity had greatly increased. The time needed for the process shortened from the previous 10 hours to 6 hours. But the cost was also enormous. His 20-something pieces of second-grade Jingshi had been completely squandered. It was all due caused by the failures. But thinking about the future, he could only grit his teeth and bear it. This was the last portion of ingredients for the today. If he could successfully make it, he could just manage to return to Suqing Shimi the 3 pieces of second-grade Jingshi that he owed her. These days, as he had become familiar with Suqing Shimi, he could leave a tab as he brought materials daily. Zuomo didn't want to owe any debts. After making this fasting pill, he wanted to rest for a time and wait for the Ling herbs in the Ling fields to mature. Even though there was only a single portion, he wasn't nervous. After the repeated high-intensity practice of the past days, he was now extremely familiar with the process of making fasting pills. He didn't know if it was caused by the spiritual power, but his head seemed to be functioning better. He hadn't been weak before, but it had felt like he was in the clouds and mists. Now he seemed to have left behind those clouds. Did cultivating, embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation, make someone smarter? This idea was too nonsensical. Even Zuomo felt it was extremely absurd, and threw it to one side. Just like normal, Zuomo threw the different herbs into the cauldron, and put his hands on the 8 trigrams plate to start. The consciousness was especially sensitive to changes in Ling energy. He occasionally was able to even feel the Ling energy changes in the herbs inside the cauldron. Some became excited, some flashed and disappeared, some slowly became weaker. Even though he was very familiar with the fasting pill, but the kinds of Ling energy transformations and vibrations between the herbs still attracted his attention. Unconsciously, his consciousness became muddled. It was like the hands that were controlling the 8 trigrams plate suddenly were possessed, and abruptly changed their position. A thin string of gold light dropped from the sky and landed in his hands, then was deflected into the cauldron. After a while, he slowly became clear-headed again. When he saw the gold string, he stared in shock. How did he end up casting Art of Crimson Flame? He shook. Damn it! Don't ruin the Dan. He still owed Suqing Shimi 3 pieces of second-grade Jingshi. If this Dan was ruined, then he really had outstanding debts. His consciousness penetrated through the cauldron. A reaction had not occurred inside. Zuomo's heart jumped, and he hurriedly opened the cauldron. A green Dan was lying silently on the bottom. Zuomo released a breath. It looked as though that it hadn't been ruined. He raised the fasting pill, and prepared to put it in the pouch when he saw a glitter of gold light from the corner of his eye. He first blinked, and then rushed to hold this fasting pill on his hand in front of his eyes for a closer examination. Only upon close examination did he find that this fasting pill was different than the fasting pills he had made previously. The color was deep green, not the blue-green. If he looked even more closely, he found that there were extremely thin gold patterns mixed inside. That was the cause of that gold light that Zhuo had detected just now. Also, the weight of it was slightly heavier than normal fasting pills. Was this still a fasting pill? Zhuo wasn't so sure. Eating it to try it out, Zhuo didn't dare. But he didn't bear to throw it away. Selling it to Su Qing Shimi, he was afraid of conning someone else. He knew that the transformation definitely was caused by the art of crimson flame that he unconsciously cast when his thoughts had been wandering. Theoretically, art of crimson flame was used to gather the essence of the sun. Its base attribute should lean towards fire, and logically, the Dan shouldn't be harmful. Pondering for a while, he still decided to keep this Dan. After Master came out of the Dan room, he would then ask her. Master had entered the Dan room over 10 days ago, yet the door to the room was still tightly shut. Sometimes Zhuo couldn't help but think, was all skilled Dan cultivators like this? He had finished his quota a long time ago, but Master didn't show any signs of coming out of the Dan room. Zhuo decided to work on his own cultivation. Under the present circumstances, he had reached his limits with the 5 spells of a ling plant farmer. To progress, he needed to have jade scrolls about future stages. Other than practicing finger motions to avoid becoming out of practice, he spent the rest of his time on embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation and refining his sword essence. He didn't know if refining was the word commonly used, but he felt that it was very descriptive. Right now his sword essence had only formed. It was like a sword embryo that needed continuous hammering and grinding before it could become a true sword. Xianyin Shirshu's sword essence was deeply engraved in his head. Under that sky-shattering sword essence, he had died countless times. What he needed to do was to try to mimic Shirshu's sword essence. If he couldn't get the aura, at the least he had to form the appearance. Then he could frighten people with it. He was resolute that unless it was necessary, he wouldn't show it. Even Yubai could clearly see his origins. If it landed in the eyes of Master and the Shirshu, it would be strange if they weren't suspicious. Xianyin Shirshu had never taught him. If they pressed, Pu Yao's existence most likely couldn't be hidden. Whenever he thought about Yinzan Shirshu's icy gaze, Zhuo felt shivers go up his spine. No matter the sect, stealing was a great crime. Zhuo was very regretful now about having fought in Dongfu. Who would have thought that Yubai's eyes were so keen that he could see the origins of his sword essence? But regret was useless now. In any case, it was dealing with it as it came. The barefoot wasn't afraid of those wearing shoes. He actually put even more effort in practicing now. He couldn't use a flying sword. As a result, he could only work with art of aged gold. He faithfully followed the basic sword scriptures that Wei Xing Shixiang had left behind in the jade sticks. He hadn't felt it before, but after comprehending sword essence, Zhuo found that while these basic scriptures might be simple, but every one of them was important. So he turned back and started to practice these most basic scriptures. Before this, Zhuo had never cultivated the sword, and really could be considered a blank page in this area. After being sliced countless times by Pu Yao using Xianyin Shirshu's sword essence, he finally comprehended something. But his fundamentals were really lacking, and so even with his comprehension, it was not rooted. If he didn't steady it, the comprehension would quickly be worn away. Because of it, he was now turning back to cultivate the most basic of the basic sword scriptures. These basic scriptures were all gathered from Wei Sheng's experience of countless battles. They were practical and effective. Zhuo, who had a slight comprehension of sword essence, could look from a higher viewpoint to judge these basic scriptures, and he learned extremely quickly. These basic sword scriptures managed to help fill the gaps of Zhuo's fundamentals. In the Little West Wind Yard, Zhuo solitarily practiced those basic sword scriptures. The sword scriptures were very simple. It could be learned on the first try, but it was like Zhuo was enchanted as he patiently practiced over and over. Before meeting Pu Yao, before meeting Wei Xing Shixiang, the spell he was most skilled with, Little Art of Cloud and Rain, had been refined like this. He never hoped for any kind of enlightenment. In his mind, nothing was more practical than working at something bit by bit. Behind the most beautiful and exquisite things was the most dullness and loneliness. He was very skilled with embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation, and his Ling energy was steadily increasing. In comparison, his spiritual power progressed much faster. He was like a cultivator in seclusion. Each day was scheduled to the fullest, and no time was wasted. What was worth celebrating was that the damned crazy woman hadn't bothered him recently. Time passed like this. A sword energy fly out of the sky. Zuo, who had been practicing sword scriptures in the yard, stopped. Master had come out, jumping onto the roof, climbing onto the back of the gray-beaked goose. The gray-beaked goose gave a clear call and flew up with spread wings. It carried Zuo towards the fragrant ginger yard. Fragrant ginger yard. There was tiredness on Shifeng Rong's face. The dam-making process had been more than a month, and it had taken a heavy toll on her. When Zuo arrived, Su Qing was reporting to her what had happened in the yard during the time. Seeing Zuo come over, Shifeng Rong's face became cold. Have you made 5 fasting pills? Completed. Zuo presented the 5 fasting pills he had prepared beforehand with a lowered head. Shifeng Rong's expression eased slightly and indicated for Su Qing to take it. Nodding her head, she said, "Not bad. It seemed that you hadn't been lazy. You've just started dam making, so if you have any questions, you can ask them now." At the side, Su Qing gave an admiring expression. She might be the first seed of Fragrant Ginger Yard's outer sect disciples, and was very trusted by Shifeng Rong, but she could only learn, but didn't have the right to ask questions. However, she quickly refocused. She hadn't been thrown out. That meant she was allowed to listen. This was a rare opportunity. Hearing this, Zuo was overjoyed and asked several questions he had been puzzled by. Shifeng Rong answered them one by one. Zuo suddenly thought about the dan that he had used, Art of Crimson Flame, to make and rushed to take it out. "Master, this is a dan that I accidentally made. It seems to be different from the fasting pill. This disciple doesn't know what it is. Master, please take a look." Shifeng Rong took the dan, and couldn't help but make a sound as she carefully examined it. After a while she asked, "Tell how you made it." Zuo narrated the entire process in detail. When he mentioned that he had accidentally cast Art of Crimson Flame, Shifeng Rong seemed to have understood something. When Zuo finished, Shifeng Rong said, "This fasting pill has essence of the sun added in. The effects are extremely young and can enter the ranks of first-grade dan. After consumption, it can make one stimulated and arouse Ling energy. But the side effects afterward would most likely not be minor. I have never seen this kind of dan before. You can name it, and find your yen lishirshu to sell it, and earn some jingsher." Zuo asked dumbly, "How much could it sell for?" Shifeng Rong's face turned cold. "Go ask yourself." Finishing, she started to ignore Zuo. Zuo didn't know where he had offended his cold-faced master, and could only leave. However, he quickly became happy again. He had accidentally managed to make a Ling dan. Fasting pills could only be considered a kind of medicine dan, and couldn't be really called a Ling dan, much less enter a grade. Zuo was very clear that any Ling dan that could enter the grade, its price wouldn't be low. For Zuo, who was in desperate need of jingsher, what would make him even happier than finding a way to earn jingsher? Countless jingsher were waving their hands at him. He mused inside, he need to find a time to go see Yin Lishirshu. Chapter 44. A tragedy caused by one piece of jingsher. Zuo named this Lingdan Great Strength Pill. It sounded extremely crass, but he didn't care. He had planned on making a few more to give to Yin Lishirshu to sell for jingsher, but very quickly, he could only put this matter to the side. In the Ling fields, a batch of Ling grasses and herbs were ready for harvest. He had farmed attentively each day, like little Art of Cloud and Rain, Art of Earth Energy, and Art of Crimson Flame. He would cast it multiple times each day. And Art of Flora, and Art of Aged Gold, would be used once every couple of days. Zuo had never farmed like this in the past. Due to his diligent care, The growth of the plants in West Wind Valley was extremely outstanding. Some of the ling plants with short growth periods were ready for harvest. For Zhuemo, whose purse was rusted, this was really a perfectly timed rainstorm. Due to its importance, he even asked for a break from Master. Inside West Wind Valley, a skeleton bent over the ling fields and sweated. Finally all done. Zhuemo sat on the ground as he panted, looking at the small pile of ling plants in front of him. He was filled with satisfaction. Then he turned to look in the corner. The third-grade fire dragon grass was almost full-grown. A bright fiery red, very beautiful. He sorted out the ling grasses and herbs by type, and then by grade. Then he carefully wrapped them. After all that, Zhuemo rode the gray-beaked goose towards Yanle Shirshu's residence. When Yanle saw Zhuemo, especially the big bag on Zhuemo's back, his eyes instantly lit up. Did Shirshu grow something good? Putting down the large bag, Zhuemo wiped the sweat on his forehead. This is a bunch of ling herbs that were just grown. Shirbua, please help me sell them. Letting someone else sell them required giving 2/10 to the sect, but Zhuemo still decided to let the sect sell them. Other than the fact that Yanle Shirbua knew more about the market than he did, the sect's contribution points were very useful. And the more one contributed to the sect, their status within the sect would naturally become higher. Even though Pu Yao was in his sea of consciousness, but this fickle and perverse Ren Yao could not be relied on. Pu Yao was a completely dangerous factor. If he didn't have to touch him, it was best not to. In comparison, Zhuemo was much more willing to take advantage of the sect's power. At the very least, the elders of the sect appeared to be normal people. But this way, raising his own status in the sect had become very important. Cultivation, the higher it went, the more resources it needed. Trying to rely on an individual's power, it was far less realistic than using the power of the sect. Even roaming cultivators had their own little circles. Cultivators who truly secluded themselves were the rarest of the rare. Yanle crouched down and flipped through the ling grasses Zhuemo had brought, the joy on his face becoming heavier. Lots of good stuff. NN 3rd grade South Wolfberry, 3rd grade 7-leaf chrysanthemum. Whoa! And there's also Daystar grass, also 3rd grade. This can be sold for a pretty good price. Yanle seemed to be very familiar and recognized all of the ling grasses and grains. Zhuemo was in awe and hurriedly flattered. Shirbua is really great, you recognize all of these. Shifengrong was the smallest of the four, so Zhuemo's address of Yanle turned from Shirshu to Shirbua. Haha, in business you have to recognize those. Yanle felt very good about Zhuemo's flattery. His originally small eyes became a line and he said amiably, as expected of a ling plant farmer, to grow something, not just faster than others but better than others. Shirshu has put thought in. All you planted are things easy to sell, and at a good price. He didn't know if it was that he felt guilt. Why, but Zhuemo felt that Yanle's gaze seemed full of meaning. Did Shirbua also know about Elder Wei Nan? He forced himself to remain calm. Shirbua should also know just how poor this disciple is. If I don't plant something to sell, I won't even have the jingsher for learning about dan making. He was very grateful for his zombie face. It really was the best disguise. Yanle nodded. Haha. Without jingsher, you can't learn anything. You are a ling plant farmer now, don't worry about jingsher. As long as you keep farming, us elders wouldn't treat you unfairly. Of course. Zhuemo smiled in agreement, but his expressionless face truly gave others a strange feeling. Yanle randomly picked 2 plants out. South Wolfberry, and this gold grain red tulip. Don't sell it, you keep it. In the future, you'll use it in dan making. I remember your master had especially asked me to help gather it for her. These 2 are easily sold, but it's hard to buy. Zhuemo hurriedly put away those 2 ling herbs. Everything else I'll go help you sell. What the sect needs, I will give to you according to the market price. Finishing, he took out a piece of jingsher to hand to Zhuemo. This is a piece of 3rd grade jingsher. It's a down payment. Take it. I'll get your Liing Feng Shiji to send over the remainder in a few days. Zhuemo stared dazedly at the 3rd grade jingsher on Yanle's hand. 3rd grade jingsher. This was the first piece of 3rd grade jingsher that he had ever seen. Seeing Zhuemo's dumb gaze, Yanle couldn't help but start to laugh. He threw the Jingshi at Zuomo. "Arlight outside, don't embarrass me like this." Zuomo's brain still hadn't managed to fully recover. Previously, he had thought that this harvest would be of some value, but he had never thought that just the down payment was a piece of third-grade Jingshi. The wealth that dropped down from the sky pounded Zuomo into dizziness. He felt that his entire body was floating. He suddenly remembered another matter. Zuomo, who had been walking away, turned back and took out great strength pill. "Shirbois, can you see how much this Lingdan is worth?" Yanli took the Lingdan and narrowed his eyes for an examination. "You made it? What's its use?" Zuomo narrated what Master had said. "Then I'll try to help you sell it. Everyone takes some time to accept new Lingdan. I cannot guarantee how much I can sell this for." Yanli said after thinking. Zuomo naturally was very grateful. His purse being the fullest it had ever been, he completely forgot that he had thought of using great strength pill to earn Jingshi. Even as he returned to the little West Wind yard, he was still muddle-headed. Like a miser, he looked at this third-grade Jingshi. The color and intactness of a third-grade Jingshi far surpassed a second-grade Jingshi. All the edges were regular and complete, the entire body transparent and glowing, without any signs of impurity. It was like a clear crystal, but the Ling energy inside was extremely powerful. He gently caressed the Jingshi, a drunken expression in his eyes. Suddenly, his hands seemed to have been cut by something, and the Jingshi in his hands lit up unexpectedly. Zuomo stood paralyzed as he looked at the glowing Jingshi. A strong pounding feeling rose in his heart, as though something was going to erupt. The glow from the Jingshi gradually faded, but the pounding in Zuomo's heart became even stronger. What was going on? He was slightly panicked. "Idiot, you are entering Zhuji." Puyao suddenly appeared with a mocking smile. As he looked at Zuomo. "Zhuji?" Zuomo couldn't attend to the disdain in Puyao's voice and hurriedly asked, "What's going on? Why am I suddenly going into Zhuji?" Puyao shrugged his shoulders. "When there is enough Ling energy, naturally it is time for Zhuji. You just had been stimulated by the Ling energy in the Jingshi, so the Ling energy inside your body, woke up. Woke up. What am I supposed to do?" Zuomo didn't know what to do. Damn it. He hadn't thought he would get to Zhuji so soon. He hadn't even made any preparations. He didn't know what was going to happen next, or what he needed to do. He had always felt that Zhuji was far from him. Right, he could go ask the Shirbois. Zuomo hit his head, and prepared to run towards the gray-beaked goose. Under the shadow of the hair in front of Puyao's face, a blade-like curve silently appeared. "Don't you want power? I have a method for Zhuji pretty good. Guarantee you will successfully Zhuji, and your cultivation will increase greatly." Puyao's cool voice was filled with intense enticement. Zuomo's footsteps stopped. "What do you want?" Zuomo asked between his teeth. "Hee." Puyao pointed to Zuomo's hands with the third-grade Jingshi. As expected, this Renyao didn't have good intentions, so he was aiming for his third-grade Jingshi. Chapter 45 Struggle Cold Mist Valley, beside the icy pond. Zuomo looked horrific. His entire body looked like a cooked shrimp, red to the point of dripping blood. Bloody veins filled his eyes, which were extremely shocking. In the yard, his body had been like a ball of fire. Right now, he felt his entire body was firewood that had been completely dried, and then lit up, and was cracking as it burned. He looked around slightly dazed. Everything in his vision seemed to have been twisted by the high temperature. His awareness was muddled. Hot. He seemed to be struggling in a sea of fire, the relentless waves of fire suffocating him. At any moment, it seemed he would turn into dust. "Eat the fire dragon grass." A faraway voice floated into Zuomo's ears. Instinctively, Zuomo shoved the fire dragon grass in his hand into his mouth. A wave of heat traveled through his mouth into his throat. Boom. It was like throwing a pot of hot oil onto fire. In a daze, Zuomo felt the sea of fire seem to have collapsed, and countless fine and scorching flames spread through his organs. The rush of heat was like liquid metal bouncing around in Zuomo's meridians. Ah! Zuomo couldn't stop himself from screaming. A hot stream rushed into his head. His fragile head seemed to have been branded with hot metal. Poof! A flame suddenly ran onto his clothing. The fire quickly spread. In the blink of an eye, all the clothing on his body turned to flames. What was strange was the fire didn't wound Zuemo at all. Zuemo was naked in the air, his entire body red like a metal skeleton that just came out of the forge. It was possible to see with the naked eye the waves of hot air that were surrounding his body. Ah! The howls were deep and rough like those of a beast. All the blood vessels in Zuemo's body were enlarged, like metal threads that were being burnt as they encompassed his entire body. So pleasing to the ears. Looking on from the side, Pu Yao's face was intoxicated as he sighed. Even the soul is in pain. It's been so long since I've heard such an enchanting sound, I really missed it. Ah! Zuemo completely lost his mind. He was like a wild beast whose entire body was burning, and howled instinctively. The fire didn't seem content rushing inside his body, and burrowed out of his skin, shrouding his body. He became a ball of fire. If Zuemo was clear-headed at this moment, he would be shocked to find the fire that was burning his body was deep red and alluring, extremely similar to the fire in his sea of consciousness. Looking at the deep red flames that were furiously dancing on Zuemo's body, Pu Yao's gaze instantly darkened. The corner of his mouth, however, swept up. It was unknown what he had been reminded of. The sound of Zuemo's howls became even deeper, even rougher. The flames surrounding him seemed to burn even more ferociously. Pu Yao's expression changed. After a while, his gaze returned to normal, and he said to himself, "The person you chose, I'll give him one chance." Finishing, he pointed a finger at Zuemo. Zuemo seemed to have been struck by a large hammer, and was sent flying, landing with a splash in the cold pond. Zuemo was like a stone quickly sinking. Strangely, the deep red flames around his body were not affected in the slightest by the water, and were still furiously waving. Just at this time, the ice river in Zuemo's sea of consciousness suddenly started to grind. The icicles crowding in the ice river were pushed by an invisible force, and slowly started to flow. The silent and straight ice river, in the blink of an eye, transformed into a river where countless big and small sword energies were moving. Hiss, hiss, hiss. These sword energies followed the surface of the river, as they headed for the flames surrounding the river. As the icy sword essences touched the dancing flames beside the shores, the unexpected happened. The fire grew dramatically. In the sea of consciousness, the fire reached the sky. Even the star in the void overhead was almost consumed by the fire. Only the gravestone in the sea of consciousness was still shrouded in the black clouds, not affected in the slightest. Inside the ice river, the icicles rose up and down even fiercer, the sword essences continuously shooting out with white mist towards the sea of fire. An astounding change was also appearing on Zuemo's body. A thin layer of ice had appeared on his entirely fleshed body, yet in the blink of an eye, this thin layer would melt and disappear. But after a while, the layer of ice would appear again and repeat. The cold pond wasn't deep. Zuemo quickly reached the bottom of the pond. The temperature at the bottom of the pond was multiple times colder than the water at the top. No fish or shrimp to be found. As though it was affected, each time the thin ice appeared, the time it stayed became longer. However, the fires around Zuemo's body wasn't weakened at all. They were still burning weirdly in the water. A faint light suddenly appeared in Zuemo's chest. This light traveled through Zuemo's channels. Every place it passed through, the flame would become smaller, but then very quickly, the red flames would once again continue their dancing. Zuemo seemed to have entered a very strange place. He had completely lost control of his body. Hazily, he felt that he was being burned in a furnace, and then suddenly thrown into the polar regions. But no matter the torment, he didn't have any room to struggle. "Don't forget. Even in death, you must not forget." The voice appeared again. A basin of cold water seemed to have been poured over Zuemo's head. His consciousness recovered clarity for a short moment. Upon clarity, the extreme pain of burning and the bone-aching cold flooded him like the tide. Ah! He couldn't help opening his mouth. The icy pond water instantly poured into his mouth. There was nothing that could describe his feelings at this moment. His entire body was furiously burning. The extreme pain from his flesh and bones burning bit by bit almost made him faint. The pond water that had poured in almost froze him to an ice cube. His clear mind instantly became dizzy again. Was this Juji? Was this the power of the fire dragon grass? That dream. In a daze, Zuomo's relaxed hands suddenly turned into fists. His entire body bowed, all the strength in the body gathering at this moment. His eyes widened furiously bright red. Who wanted to control me? Who changed my face and erased my mind? Who did it? Who did it? From the depths of his mind, countless thoughts uncontrollably streamed through. From the depths of his body came a pain of his flesh burning, and the bone-breaking coldness. Inside his angry eyes, the flames were swallowed by a bloody red tide. Who did it? Who did it? Who did it? Bastard! The blood in his chest roared. The anger and grief that came from the deepest part of his heart erupted like a volcano. In an instant, it swallowed the fire and the ice. Zuomo seemed to be cursed. He gathered all the energy in his body and threw out his fist. Accompanied by the deep red alluring flames, his fist heavily smashed onto the rock side of the pond. Boom! With Zuomo's fist as the center, a spiderweb of cracks appeared on the rock face. Scorch marks spread out from the center of the impact. Boom! Another punch. Stone fragments flew into the water. A few of them brushed past Zuomo's body, creating a few marks. The fresh blood flowed out, quickly dissolving in the water. Boom boom boom. Zuomo was completely stuck in a trance. His eyes bright red, the tendons tight, he furiously threw out punches. The silent bottom of the pond turned into a muddy mess. Beside the pond, Puyao detected the vibrations of the ground. Looking at the whirlpool that appeared in the body, his expression was normal as he raised a hand and caught a water droplet that flew out from the waterfall. Opening his hand, the water drop floated above his bond, round and clear as it reflected his blood eye. You're still not giving a hand? Do you still stupidly believe he could suppress the fire of the sky, Yao? A faint mocking smile appeared on his face as he slowly stated, You are always like this, never listening to me. 3,000 years have passed, yet you are still so stubborn. Do you not know that your choices are forever this idiotic? He gently blew, and the perfect water droplet floating in his hand turned to a gust of mist and dissipated into the air. Your actions, I was sick of them long ago. Puyao patted his hand, his expression indifferent. The vibrations under his feet stopped. The pond recovered its quiet. It's done. Puyao's sharp lips rose and he shrugged. Haha, this only proved once again your idiotic choices. He just turned his head when he stopped in his steps. Wukong Mountain. Xiang Yan, who had been in meditation, suddenly opened his eyes. He jumped up, his body disappearing. In the blink of an eye, he appeared at the peak. A few seconds later, Pei Yuan ran. Yen Lu and Shifeng Rong also flew over and appeared beside him. The four exchanged looks, and with shocked faces, they raised their heads to look at the sky. Dongfu Tiansongzi was browsing the list that Yubai had written. This Zhong Mingyan is Zuomei Tian's disciple. Tiansongzi nodded as he remarked. In Dongfu, if we're talking about strength, it's between Zuomei Tian and Xianyan. Zuomei Tian had been very fierce in the past, a person everyone was afraid of. This point was very similar to Xianyan. But I wonder what his disciple is like. Yubai said respectfully. This disciple had met that Zhong Mingyan once. Even though we didn't fight, but this disciple gathers from his composure that he most likely isn't weak. Haha, there's isn't many youths that you call not weak. I heard that Zuomei Tian had put in a lot of blood on this disciple. It's natural he wouldn't be weak. Tian Songzi chuckled. In the future, Dongfu is probably yours, Zhong Mingyan and Wukong Sword Sex Wei Sheng's world. This disciple will not disappoint Master's hopes. Yubai responded respectfully. Tian Songzi waved his hands. Don't care too much about things like reputation. I only hope you can protect yourself in troubled times. This estate, I might not bear to part with it, but your safety is even more important. Yubai was moved and responded. Yes. Seeing Yubai's face was full of worry, Tian Songzi couldn't help but comfort. This master is only planning ahead. Don't worry too much. If something really happens, haha, us old people will be at the front. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a name on the list and was slightly shocked. When was there a Zhuo out of Wukong sword sect? How is he special? The first time this disciple heard this name, he had been in a conflict with Zhong Mingyan and another Dongqi disciples. Because he is a Ling plant farmer, this disciple had been planning on resolving it. I did not expect that he managed to comprehend sword essence. Yubai added another sentence. He has not entered Juji. Oh, Tian Songzi's expression changed. Another dangerous character in Wukong sword sect. Comprehending sword essence before entering Juji. This kind of sword talent, it's very rare. The heavens really have blessed Wukong sword sect. Between his words he was slightly envious. Just at this time, his expression suddenly changed and flew out the window. Yubai paused before hurriedly following. He only saw Tian Songzi staring in a daze at the sky above. At the same time, on the highest plum peak of Dongqi sword sect, a long-haired black-robed man stood against the wind. With a shocked face, he raised his head to look at the sky. Chapter 46 Juji the peak of daytime. The sky was blue and clear. Yet what raised people's hairs was that the blue sky was filled with blazing stars. Stars in daytime. Pei Yuan Ran muttered to himself. The other three's expressions all changed. Xixiang. Shifeng Rong's voice was slightly trembling. What is happening here? I don't know. Pei Yuan Ran's expression was heavy as he shook his head. The apparition of stars appearing in daytime. It happens once every few thousand years. I've only seen it in some records. But it doesn't seem to be a good omen. Even though the four were all Jin Dan, looking at the strange scene in front of them, their hearts couldn't help but feel cold. In Dongfu, Yubai stared with wide eyes at the stars dotting the sky, and that proud sun hanging high up in the sky. Fear rose up from the deepest part of his heart, and spread through his body. Tian Songzi muttered. Stars in daytime. The plum peak of Dongqi. Light erupted from Zhuo Tian's eyes as he murmured. Stars in daytime. In the entire sky Moonjia, countless strong people were all alarmed. Looking up at the sky over the 13 primary towns of Sky Moonjia, it was completely filled with cultivators. In the wilderness on the mountaintops, no matter what the Xiozhou were doing, they all stopped their hands and floated in midair. All of the cultivators' gazes, they were completely focuses on this sky that they were so familiar with. No matter their cultivation, shock was on everyone's face. In Cold Mist Valley, Pu Yao's pupil shrunk. He gazed at the pond before him. In his blood-red vision, he could clearly see a pillar of light that glittered as it came down from the sky and entered the pond. If one used a normal vision, where could they even see a pillar? No Ling energy, no vibrations. Only through his blood eye could this intangible pillar of light be seen. Do you think you had wagered correctly? Pu Yao said coldly, murderous intent in his right blood eye. When the sound landed, the clear pond suddenly became as dark as ink. The sound of the waterfall disappeared without a trace. The waterfall was like a broken mustang, docilely flowing into the pond without a splash. The valley fell into a strange silence. Looking at the black water pond, Pu Yao wasn't afraid. He took a strong stride forward, pressing. For this trash you decide to fight me? The black water pond was silent and motionless, as though it was dead. A Yao pond. They confronted each other like this. Time slipped away. Pu Yao suddenly took back the leg he had stepped with, his expression returning to normal. A kind of disdain was at the corner of his mouth. Stars and daylight. Hey, do you really think this is still 3,000 years ago? You made it too big. He was somewhat rejoicing at the calamity. The black water pond wasn't affected. Pu Yao shrugged. So what if it's stars and daylight? Can it extinguish Sky Yao fire? The Sky Yao fire even you can't extinguish? The black water pond suddenly started to flip as though it was boiling. Explosive sounds came out of the inky black water. Pu Yao raised his head to look at the sky, and lightly said a sentence that instantly made the pond water quiet. Oh, it seems everyone wants to see. In the blink of an eye, the pond regained its clarity. The obedient waterfall resumed its ferocity and roared, the water splashing. Pu Yao gave a light laugh and disappeared. An extremely strong consciousness scanned over Cold Mist Valley. When Zhuo opened his eyes, he instantly shuddered. So cold. The coldness of the water told him where he was situated. The cold pond of Cold Mist Valley. Last time. It had been here where he had broken through to one breath. He was very familiar with this situation. But after he had achieved one breath, he had never felt suffocated in the water. In the past, Zuemo had actually been suspicious that he might turn into a fish. Ouch. Zuemo bared his teeth. So painful. Any movement, and a heart-wrenching pain would come from all over his body. His features instantly twisted. Thankfully he wasn't dead. What he could remember up until was when that hazy voice told him to eat the fire dragon grass. What happened after, he didn't know at all. But right now, he wasn't willing to think, too lazy to move. His entire body was hurting and very quickly. He found he wasn't wearing a scrap of clothing. How would he get out? He wanted to laugh but couldn't. Right now he didn't want to think about anything. He just wanted to go to sleep. But the pond water was really too cold, so cold it reached his heart. This wasn't a good place to sleep. Why was it that every time, he would torment himself so much? Forcing himself alert, he gritted his teeth and entered mediation. He wanted to know what his situation really was like. The Ling energy in his body abruptly appeared in front of him. He was first struck dumb, and then was overjoyed. Zuji. He had completed Juji. Internal vision. This was internal vision. In a trance, he saw the three-dimensional diagram of the Ling energy moving through his body. Each strand of Ling energy was so clear for him to see. He felt as though he could see all objects, his mind becoming clear. Zuemo didn't know how long it was until his thoughts refocused. He hurriedly inspected his Ling energy again, and to his surprise, he found his Ling energy was 3 times what it had been originally been. No wonder the distance between the 10th level of Lianqi and Juji was a great canyon. It really was a canyon. He had just entered Juji, and his cultivation had increased 3 times. Think of the power disparity. It might have been caused by excess happiness, but the pain from his body seemed to lessen greatly. Zuemo struggled out of the bottom of the pond and floated towards the top. When his head came out of the water, he couldn't help sucking in a breath. He hadn't thought that he would really make it through the fire dragon grass. Even now, he was still somewhat in disbelief. Fire dragon grass was something that only terrifying and abnormal people like Shixiang could endure. But he actually made it through. But he still had lingering fears. The danger involved could be deduced from the pain of his entire body. But he finally made it through. He opened his mouth and wanted to laugh, but found that his throat was dry and painful, unable to make a sound. His hands pushed against the side of the pond, trying to climb out. His body shuddered in great pain, and almost made him faint. With no other solution, he could only use his hands to grab a rock beside the pond, his body soaking in the water. The joy after surviving a calamity made everything seem so beautiful. After a long time, the pain lessened slightly and his strength had slightly recovered. Struggling to climb out of the pond, he found the jade scrolls, and other times scattered on the ground. He carefully picked them all up. What really made him feel pain was that 3rd-grade spirit traveling seal. It had burnt down to only a small scrap. Did his body really combust? He still remembered the strong feeling of burning before he became unconscious, but that was all he remembered. Thankfully, most of his belongings like talismans and jade sticks were still undamaged. But since the spirit traveling seal was gone, and he was naked, how would he get back to West Wind Valley? Suddenly he had an idea. Casting Little Art of Cloud and Rain, he saw a white ball of clouds appear in front of him. He snickered, his hands maintaining the spell as his body sneaked into the cloud. Oh, cold, very comfortable. Very quickly, he found that the pain in his body seemed to have lessened slightly. Did Little Art of Cloud and Rain have healing properties? But this wasn't the time to study it. He should think of a way to get back. Old Black had finished his work in the fields and was preparing to return home. Walking on the road, he couldn't help but ponder what he had just seen. Thinking about it now, he felt his heart tremble. Stars appearing during daytime. There were many strange things in the world, natural abnormalities. Was this a bad omen? He couldn't help but raise his head. In the blue sky, other than the sun, there was nothing else. Old Black exhaled. Normal was good. Normal was good. Normality was the best. Please don't have any change. As he thought aimlessly, he walked back towards his residence. Where he was living now was the big yard that Zuemo had lived in previously. Detecting that someone was coming opposite him, he raised his head. At a glance, he was pinned to the ground, his expression dumbstruck. After a pause, he recovered and stammered. "Little you are." Zuemo was completely shrouded in a white cloud. Only his head was left sticking out. Looking down, Old Black could barely make out a pair of bare feet. Old Black felt this white cloud seemed familiar. He suddenly realized, wasn't this the cloud from Little Art of Cloud and Rain? Was he taking a bath? Thinking about the rain of Little Art of Cloud and Rain, Old Black felt that this creativity was pretty good. But he didn't need to bathe on the mountain road and wash as he kept on walking. Zuemo was extremely embarrassed and wanted to find a crack in the ground to hide himself. But due to his zombie face, there wasn't any bashfulness, no embarrassment. He seemed very at ease. His entire body was in pain. Any movement, and the pain would pierce his heart. He could only laboriously move his feet step by step. Old Black decided to give a compliment. He reached out with his thumb. "Little Mog, this trick is great." Zuemo felt that there weren't any words that could describe his feelings right now. He could only nod his head solemnly in acknowledgement, and then slowly walk down the path. Looking at the back of the white ball slowly moving, even Old Black couldn't help but feel that Little Mog's bearing had really improved. What made Zuemo feel hopeless was that he had encountered quite a few outer sect disciples as he made his way. Their strange gazes made Zuemo's hair stand up. When he reached West Wind Valley, he almost wept tears of joy. But when he appeared at the gates of his own little yard, the gray-beaked goose at the rooftop was suddenly alarmed and quickly used its wings to cover its eyes. Zuemo's heart instantly shattered into countless pieces, landing on the ground. So this gray bird was female. What made Zuemo feel depressed was that this female bird sneakily created a small opening through her wings and peeped through from behind. And what made his teeth itch even more was that this female bird's gaze turned from curious to disdainful. "Damn bird." Humiliated, Zuemo angrily sent out a sword energy. "Honk!" The gray-beaked goose shouted in alarm and nimbly dodged. It flew into the air, and then suddenly extended its neck, full of disdain as it spat at the ground. Zuemo almost fainted in anger. He threw out hatefully, "You are a dead bird, just wait." What he was thankful for was that he hadn't encountered an elder on his way. If Master saw his state, she would beat him halfway to death and throw him down the mountain to feed the dogs. Laboriously moving into the room, he collapsed on the bed. He didn't want to move, he didn't want to think, didn't want to move a fingertip. He was exhausted. Very quickly, he slipped into a deep sleep. Before sleeping, he lightly muttered, "Juji." Master was a Jindan. Zuemo took a deep breath, raised his expressionless face, and the hands that had been at his side silently turned to fists. It was very far, far enough to make him feel it was impossible. There were countless cultivators. How many would become Jindan? To say of nothing else, but in the second generation of the entire sect, the only one that had hopes of becoming Jindan was Wei Shengxixiang himself. A guy that only had some talent in the area of 5 elements. If it was becoming a strong ling plant farmer, Zuemo didn't have any doubts of whether he could achieve it. But achieving Jindan, his most optimistic prediction was only just a hope of 1 in 10,000. After he learned of his changed features and erased mind, he had continuously asked himself, was it really worth it to pursue after such an illusory and distant goal? Right now, as a ling plant farmer, his life would become better and better. If he formed a relationship with someone, his own descendants would have a pretty good life. But this, gambling living his life, to pursue that goal that had almost no chance of winning, was it worth it? Whenever he started to sway, he would always think of that dream that frequently appeared, that kept on repeating, "Even in death, you must not forget." Every time he would ask himself, what was it that he could not forget even if he died? He didn't know. He was a cowardly person. In order to live he could flatter, could bow his spine, but he wanted to know. The change in his frame of mind caused the change in his attitude to his cultivation to change completely. He worked more, worked harder. He knew just how low his starting point was. He also knew that his own innate talents were not good. But he also knew he had his own advantages. Pooh! Even though he had cursed this damned perverse Rinyao countless times. But Zuemo still needed to thank him. Without Pu Yao, he couldn't even see a hint of sunlight. For this sliver of light, even if he had to pay some things, he was still willing. This time, Zhuji had been a painful ordeal for him. But for some reason, his mental state became calmer, his thoughts clearer. Being a Ling plant farmer could dramatically increase his position in the sect. But clearly, a Ling plant farmer could not help him complete his goal. What he could rely on in this area was still sword scriptures. Ling plant farming. In the future, it was an important technique to earn Jingshi, but not his main path of development. There were many paths to increase attack power, but of the many types of cultivation, the one with strongest attack power were sword cultivators. Even more, he was situated in a sword sect, and naturally wouldn't abandon what was near to reach for the far. He might not have much talent with the sword, but he just needed to work harder. Thinking about sword cultivation, he remembered that after Zhuji, he could imprint a flying sword. Very quickly, he ran into difficulties. He didn't have a scripture for imprinting a flying sword. In Fragrant Ginger Yard, Shifeng Rong was shocked when she saw Zuemo, but instantly recovered. Even with Zhuji, you cannot be lazy. Go to the records room. You will be able to read some of the jade sticks. Coming out next time, I will personally test you. If you were lazy, there will be a heavy punishment. The last few words were extremely threatening. Zuemo cowered under Master's scolding, and could only murmur in affirmation. Inside, he wailed at his misfortune. It seemed he had hit Master's sore point somehow, and couldn't help but wonder who had irritated Master. Only when Master's anger had decreased some did he cautiously open. Master, this disciple wants to request a scripture for impressing a flying sword. Impressing a flying sword? Shifeng Rong couldn't help but frown and said with some dissatisfaction. Your priority should be Ling farming and Dan making. Don't be greedy. Too greedy and you cannot digest it all. Don't you understand that? Zuemo heard this and grimaced. He just knew he wouldn't receive a good scripture. His mouth went. This disciple understands. But our Wukong sect is a sword sect. If this disciple doesn't know how to even impress a flying sword, walking out, wouldn't it shame the sect? That's true. Hearing this, Shifeng Rong thought it was reasonable. You can go see your Shixiang Su Yi and find a scripture to practice. Do not spend too much effort. Yes. Zuemo agreed docilely. Go. Shifeng Rong discourteously sent him away. The stars in daytime that had appeared yesterday caused his mood to be bad to the extreme. She had heard some of the rumors about stars in daytime. There were all kinds of strange ones, but one point was unusually unanimous. That was, it wasn't a good thing. If this kind of incident had happened in one of the other Jia, she could go spectate, but since it happened in Tianyu Jia, her mood became bad. Especially when she saw the worry in her sect leader Shixiang's eyes, her mood became worse. She knew sect leader Shixiang very well. Sect leader Shixiang never was panicked. Since even he was worried this time, the situation probably was worse than she had imagined. If this lady knew who was the one behind all this, humph. Murderous intent flashed through her eyes, causing Su Qing at the side to jump in fright. Even as he left Fragrant Ginger Yard, Zuemo felt that his chest was heavy. He knew that Master was looking out for him, but he could not tell his reasons to Master. It seemed that he had thought too simply. Zuemo grimaced inside. Originally, he had assumed that if his contribution to the sect was large, the sect would naturally increase his benefits, and he wouldn't have to worry about things like scriptures. Now he knew that he had expected too much. His benefits would naturally increase, but benefits were also sorted into areas. Things like spells were the very core of a sect. Would they easily give it to others? Right now, he could only hope for Wei Sheng Shixiang to come out of the sword cave and teach him some moves. He still decided to take a trip to Su Yi Shixiang's place. He might not get a good spell, but he could seek a substitute. He'll take an average one. He had nothing in terms of sword scriptures. He was a page of white. Learning something would help his fundamentals. If the sect won't give, then he'll just buy it. If the Jingshi that he threw out was numerous enough, he would naturally be able to buy a pretty good sword scripture. Gu is a ling plant farmer. Am I someone that would lack for Jingshi? He completely forgot that his last piece of Jingshi had been extracted by Pu Yao. In the sea of consciousness, the sea of fire roared. If Zuemo came in, he would certainly be in for a fright. The dancing deep red flames had grown a section higher. The temperature of the ice river seemed to have decreased. And the biggest change was the star in the sky, bright as a diamond, magnificent and dazzling. On the gravestone shrouded in the black clouds, Pu Yao lazily used his hand to support his perfect and flawless chin, the other hand rubbing a pile of powder, muttering to himself. Used up all the Jingshi, ah. This guy is really a piece of trash. Even getting a Jingshi requires almost killing himself. He said to the air. If I knew earlier, I'd have gone myself. Now it's great. You made the incident big. So many powerful guys have arrived from outside. Even dead, you're still making trouble for me. It really is inflexible to the death. The white powder dribbled from the cracks in his hands. A lonely Yao sat on the gravestone and said ruefully, the landlord doesn't have any surplus either. In the Hall of Hearing Principles, Sui was slightly shocked when he saw Zuemo, but quickly recovered his composure. He smiled, opening. It's a rare occasion for Shitty to come. Come, sit. Zuemo looked at Sui Shixiang. The other was a person that he had admired very much when he had been an outer sect disciple. He had never thought that he could sit on equal ground with him now. The affairs of the world, it really was fickle. He couldn't help but sigh. Zuemo has to thank Shixiang for guidance in the past. He sincerely gave a bow. Sui blanked, and then hurried to help Zuemo up. Shitty doesn't have to be so courteous. That was just my duty. After this exchange of words, both felt that they were much closer to each other. It's rare for Shitty to come have a taste of my tea. Su Yi's hands twisted. A set of tea equipment appeared in front of him. A yellow bamboo tea tray carved with 2 clouds. Simple and humble. On top was a purple clay teapot. The light flashed across the purple clay teapot. Formations clearly were carved on it. 7 small cups like the 7 stars of the Northern Dipper. Sui took out a square jade box. When it was opened, Zuemo felt a fragrance spread towards him. I hadn't thought that since Shitty had received the jade medal, you still want to cultivate the sword. I'm just playing around. Zuemo hurriedly replied. After being cracked down by Master, he felt it was better not to say anything. Haha, a man wanting to improve the sword, it isn't something embarrassing. Wielding a sword in the world, kill Yao and exterminate Mo. It is amazing. Shixiang had been like this before, but later, found that my talents were average, and hard to achieve anything, so turned to learning forging. Sui first laughed at himself and then said seriously. Since Shitty is interested in the sword, Shixiang has spent some more time in the sect, so knows a bit more, and can chat about it with Shitty. When Zuemo heard kill Yao and exterminate Mo, he couldn't help but grimace bitterly inside. Thinking about the perverse Renyao, he felt it was more likely that he would be killed and exterminated. But he still said solemnly, "Thank you, Shixiang." Chapter 48. The Black-Hearted Records Room. Our sect is a sword sect. Our strongest sword scripture is the Void Sword Scripture that our founder created. But our sect had gradually declined. This sword scripture that had been ranked 6th grade could not be learned by anyone in the sect. Somehow after that, it was split into Shapeless Sword Scripture and Empty Sword Scripture. The one that Luoli Shitty practices is Empty Sword Scripture. But these 2 scriptures that were split only reached 3rd grade. Other than this, the other one of importance is Master's Ice Dragon Sword Scripture. This sword scripture is a 4th grade sword scripture. In the hands of Master, it blossomed and managed to enter the ranks of 5th grade. In the past, it was with this sword scripture that Master had killed countless Yaoma in Yao Hunt, and received the title of Ice Dragon Sword. As he talked about his master Xian Yen, Sui wandered away in his thoughts. A 4th grade sword scripture that was able to elevate into 5th grade. It was enough to show that Xian Yin Shirshu's abilities with Ice Dragon Sword Scripture didn't just reach deeply, but that he had improved this sword scripture. No one who was able to do this was ordinary. Other than this, the ancestors of our sect were also skilled. Cloud Sword Scripture, Red Flame Sword Scripture, Emerald Sword Scripture. They are all 4th grade. Haha shitty. Don't just think that our sect doesn't have any reputation in Dongfu. But in Dongfu, other than Dongfu Hall, only we have a 6th grade sword scripture. Even 4th grade scriptures. Not just any sect in Dongfu has one. Zuomo's eyes widened. He had never thought that the sect was so strong. Sui noticed Zuomo's eyes and smiled. Shitty, don't think too optimistically. Sword scriptures above 4th level. The sect wouldn't easily pass it on to the disciples. What the sect leader and the Shirshu believe is better to have nothing than accept a shoddy choice. In the past, Luoli Shitty was unparalleled in the 2nd generation, but even so, he was only passed on the 3rd grade sword scripture. Empty sword scripture. Seeing the disappointment in Zuomo's eyes, he comforted. Shitty, don't be too disappointed. There are very fine ones among the 3rd grade sword scriptures, like the empty sword scripture that Luoli Shitty learnt, and that shapeless sword scripture that also came from void sword scripture. They are the extreme best among 3rd grade sword sections. Shitty, you have to pay attention. They might all be 3rd grade sword scriptures, but there are still differences. Zuomo instantly raised his ears. It was too hard to pursue those good ones, but he shouldn't pick the worst ones. He was very practical. The item less a bit, but the Jingshi difference wouldn't just be a bit. Usually 5 elements sword scriptures are the worst. Shitty is a Ling plant farmer, and your understanding of the 5 elements definitely is deeper than mine. The 5 elements encompass millions of changes, yet lose their purity. To cultivate the sword, what cannot be lost is purity. But the 5 elements birth and defeat each other, and are difficult to make pure. I had never heard of a 5 elements sword scripture that went above 3rd grade. Shitty, don't try to pick this kind of sword scripture. The other sword scriptures, they all have their attributes. Some are fierce and powerful, good for killing in battle. Some are strange and unpredictable, good for ambushing. Some nurture the mind and increase cultivation. Nurture the mind? Aren't sword scriptures primarily for killing? How can it nurture the mind? Zuomo couldn't help asking. Haha, cultivation is long and difficult. If there isn't a strong and resolute heart, how can one achieve the path? To use the sword to nurture the heart, to harden the core. Many people practice this kind of sword scripture. Like me, I have Heaven Heart sword scripture. This kind of sword scripture, it doesn't have much power, but to nurture and fix the mind, it's pretty good. Sui smiled as he explained. The sect records at Riverside Peak. You are an inner sect disciple now, and can go in to read. But it requires contribution points each time. If Shitty has spare time, remember to earn more sect contribution points. In the future, you'll need to use them. Sui emphasized. Bidding farewell to Sui Shixiang, Zuomo headed straight for Riverside Peak. There was a river below Riverside Peak. The mountain was steep, and so the records room was built against the cliff. It wasn't big, just a small compound. There were some thin bamboo stalks planted beside the walls, the outer walls slightly crumbling. Zuomo was somewhat disappointed. He had never been here before. This place was only open to inner sect disciples. The person guarding the door was an old one. At the beginning, Zuomo fantasized that the other was some high master, but he was quickly disappointed. This old man guarding the door only had a cultivation of Lianqi 9th level. However, Zuomo didn't dare to disrespect him. The common saying was good. The existing official wasn't as good as the existing manager. Don't just look at how bad the old man's cultivation was, but he guarded the records room. If he wanted to make trouble, it was a very easy thing to do. Respectfully handing over his medal, the old man scanned it and lowered down his face, saying, 2 hours on the first level is 2 contribution points. 2 hours on the second floor is 4 contribution points. The jade scrolls in the first level can be copied. The second level is restricted from copying. Go in. He threw the medal back to Zuomo. So black. Zuomo swore inside. The contribution points of inner sect disciples were not the same as outer sect disciples, and they could not be converted. Zuomo only had in total 10 contribution points. 5 of them had been the reward the sect leader gave him for receiving the jade medal. The other 5 were from last time when he let Yin Le Shirshu sell his plants. 10 contribution points. It was enough for him to stay 10 hours on the first floor and 5 on the second. If it was copying a jade scroll, even the most basic would be 2 or so hours. And if it couldn't be copied, then it had to be memorized. That wasn't something that could be accomplished in a few hours. Now he understood why Sui Shixiang reminded him to earn more contribution points. So the big cost was here. He was suddenly grateful that the dam-making records room of his master didn't require contribution points. Otherwise he could only cry. Zuemo guessed that Xianyan Shirshu definitely would have a private forging records room. Otherwise, Sui Shixiang would be in a terrible bind. Time was tight, and didn't allow Zuemo to think. He ran straight into the first floor. He saw rows of jade scrolls organized neatly. Zuemo couldn't help twist his mouth. From what he saw, this was much worse than Master's records room. A layer of dust had accumulated on the wooden boards. It looked like there usually weren't many people, even though it lacked care. But the arrangement of the jade scrolls was easy to follow. There were all kinds of jade scrolls. Sword scriptures, 5 elements, cultivation scriptures, forging. These were the jade scrolls that the elders of the sect that searched and gathered over the generations. The grade of these jade scrolls weren't high, didn't have much practical value, but it would have been a pity to throw them out, so the sect had created a records room to support the inner sect members to study. This kind of jade scrolls were only useful to those who had just become an inner sect disciple. As they spent longer with their master, the worth of these jade scrolls would decrease. It had been a long time since Wukong Sword Sect had new inner sect disciples come in. After Li Yingfeng became an inner sect disciple, she spent each day with Yin Le Shirshu taking care of all the different business. And after Wei Sheng Shixiang became an inner sect disciple, he received Xianyan Shirshu's meticulous teachings, and then entered the sword cave. Therefore, he naturally didn't come here. So when Zuemo came in, he saw this dusty scene. Even though there wasn't high-level spells, but the roomful of jade scrolls still made Zuemo's eyes turn dizzy and drool. Don't just think that these jade scrolls weren't important. If they were thrown onto the market, each one could be sold for a pretty good price. For Lianqi disciples, each jade scroll would be a treasure. Zuemo headed straight for the sword scriptures. It was also the largest topic on the first floor. Wukong Sword Sect was a sword sect, so naturally, it would put all possible effort into gathering sword scriptures. There were large numbers of second and third grade sword scriptures on the first floor. Naturally, they weren't of high quality. After making a cursory examination, he quickly put them down. As expected, there was nothing really good. It wasn't bad as a reference, but for a primary method, it wasn't really good. Looking at the stars for the second floor, he hesitated a second, and then decided to go up to see. The second floor was slightly smaller, and there was a dramatically smaller number of jade scroll. But the scene was very similar to Master's records room. The jade scrolls were all floating in midair, each jade scroll surrounding by differently colored whirlpools. Having had a similar experience, Zuemo naturally knew what to do. He scanned through the jade scrolls about sword scriptures one by one. Even now, he still hadn't decided what kind of sword scripture to cultivate. If it had been before, he might have chosen to be like Sui Shixiang and practice something like Sky Heart Sword Scripture. This kind of sword scripture cultivated the resolve of the cultivator, something that was crucial. However, for him that was pursuing strength, finding those sword scriptures that had greater power was more realistic. Undecided, Zuemo flipped and read through them one by one. He had never seen so many jade scrolls at the same time. The jade scrolls from the second level. If it had been in the past, they would all have been treasures that he would have dreamed about. He couldn't help but feel as though he was in a dream. As expected, the sword scriptures that Sui Shixiang had mentioned were all absent. The second floor were entirely third-grade sword scriptures, but were distinctively of higher quality than the jade scrolls downstairs. They should be the finest of the third grade. There was a set of wind and thunder sword scripture. After cultivating it, one would float like the wind, power like thunder, the effectiveness shocking. Supposedly it had originally been a 5th grade sword scripture, But after continuous loss over thousands of years, its power declined, and it was demoted to 3rd grade. And another even stranger was Autumn Rain Sword Scripture. It required a set of 108 swords. The moves were like rain, extremely difficult to block. But just like Wind and Thunder Sword Scripture, much of its contents had been lost, especially the method of making the swords. The power of each individual sword dropped dramatically, and it entered an awkward state. But its manipulations were very exquisite, so it was put on the 2nd floor. Each sword scripture had its unique strengths, but similarly, they all had a great flaw. Seeing that the jade scrolls he hadn't read become less and less, Zuemo started to become panicked. Was he unable to find an appropriate sword scripture for himself? He completely forgot that time was flowing away. As the number of the jade scrolls decreased one by one, his heart started to sink to the bottom bit by bit. At last he was facing the last jade scroll. Li Water Sword Scripture. Li Water. These two characters clearly connected to the 5 elements caused Zuemo's heart to jump. Sui Shixiang's words were by his ears. Shixiang had kept reminding him of the weak nature of 5-element sword scriptures. Zuemo, who had a rough understanding of the 5 elements, was very clear just how correct Shixiang was. The 5 elements had many transformations, but it was hard to purify. If the sword essence was not pure, then the power would decrease. Completely disheartened, Zuemo unconsciously read Li Water Sword Scripture. He suddenly found something, and his mind roused itself. Just as he wanted to take a closer look, his eyes suddenly flashed, and then he found himself standing in the yard. Time has ended. You have used all your contribution points. The old man's eyelids didn't even raise as he gave a dismissal. Zuemo wanted to cry. Chapter 49 Purchase Order spending 10 contribution points, but not a spell to show for it. Zuemo felt like a fool. Enraged, Zuemo raised his head to look at the decrepit building before marching away, without a second glance. Humph, when ye has contribution points, you will lie down on the 1st floor, lie down on the 2nd, sleep every day here. Zuemo didn't feel good, but was helpless. Very quickly, his brain turned to how to earn Jingshi. The contribution points of inner sect disciples were not easy to earn. Previously, when he had been an outer sect disciple, he had never been troubled by contribution points. But then he turned around his thinking. The contribution points of inner sect disciples were much more valuable than outer sect disciples. Before, no matter which jade scroll from the 2nd level, he would treat it like a treasure. When would he be so picky? There were many ways to earn contribution points. Just the ling grasses and herbs that Zuemo planted, and then if the sect sold them, they all would have contribution points. However, rules like the records room, Zuemo guessed, were common, and there would be other places that would need to use contribution points. This question was very important, and he needed to be clear. He ran to the Hall of Hearing Principles and found Sui Shixiang. After hearing Zuemo's words, Sui Shixiang explained, Shitty thought correctly. Contribution points are more useful than Jingshi in the sect. Other than Void Sword Scripture, all the other spells in the sect, including Masters, Ice Dragon Sword Scripture, and the other 4th grade sword scriptures, can all be exchanged using contribution points. Of course, the amount of contribution points needed is astonishing. Other than spells, some high-quality items, like flying swords and talismans, can also be exchanged using contribution points. You can even use your contribution points to get my master to teach you the sword or forging. I can also pay using contribution points to let Shirgu teach me dan making. Basically, contribution points are omnipotent in the sect. Then how does Shixiang earn contribution points? Zuemo asked. I usually make some talismans for the sect for Yinla Shirshu to sell. Or I forge talismans for the other Shidi in exchange for some contribution points. If Shidi needs some talisman in the future, come find me. My price is much lower than the sect. Sui didn't give up a change to promote his own talismans and continued. Like Shidi, if you become skilled at dan making in the future, it would be very fast to earn contribution points. For other people, Luoli Shidi might only be Juji, but he has achieved Empty Sword. and his attack power can compare to a cultivator in the initial stages of Ningmai. Most of his time is spent in the mines guarding the Xiao slaves. Underground is dark and uncomfortable, extremely dull. Other than Luo Li Shidi, no one is willing to go, so the contribution point that the sect gives him is extremely high. When Sui Shixiang mentioned Luo Li, Zuemo remembered something. In the second floor of the records room, I didn't see empty sword scripture and shapeless sword scripture. Shidi is in too much of a rush. These two sword scriptures, while they are third grade, but they are the finest among the third grade. It is also possible to find the shadow of void sword scripture from those two. The sect naturally is very cautious. When Shidi has spent more time in the sect, naturally you will be able to exchange for it. Zuemo understood. Leaving Sui Shixiang's place, Zuemo had a general idea of what he needed to do. It wasn't easy receiving contribution points in the sect. It seemed that his only realistic method, right now, was relying on planting ling plants. When he got to the entrance to the valley, he saw Li Yingfeng Shiji. He hurriedly greeted. Why hasn't Shiji gone in? The Jinji on Shidi's valley is very heavy. Shiji doesn't want to be too presumptuous. Li Yingfeng joked. Zuomo's heart jumped. Due to the fact that there was a ling vein beneath the rock room, he was very cautious, and had set down layers of Jinji at the mouth of the valley. Looking at it now, it seemed very risky as it caught people's attention. He forced himself to calm, responding, "There are many ling grasses growing inside the valley. I'm afraid that some animals like rabbits and foxes would get it, and damage the grasses. Then this little brother won't even have the time to cry." "That's true," Li Yingfeng nodded. "If ling grasses are ruined by those little animals, they wouldn't be worth anything. I actually have a jade scroll right now about Jinji. I'll send it over to Shidi since you can use it." Zuemo was overjoyed and gave a deep bow. "Many thanks, Shiji." "Shidi is too polite," she replied. "You and I both came up from the outer sect. It's rational for us to give mutual support." "Of course," Zuemo agreed. Both of them were clever people. This conversation quickly set down their relationship as allies. It might appear that everyone was good to him on the surface, but inner sect disciples that came from outer sect disciples usually would be pushed aside by the other inner sect disciples. Not just Wukong Sword Sect, almost all sects were like this. There weren't many second-generation disciples in Wukong Sword Sect, and most of them were outside. Other than Luo Li and Hao Min, eldest Shixiang Qincheng, eldest Shiji Gong Sun Qing and third Shiji Sui Xia were all not in the sect. The battle over eldest Shixiang between Wei Sheng and Qincheng was undoubtedly the focal point. If nothing unexpected happened, it was almost set in stone that Wei Sheng would supplant Qincheng as eldest Shixiang. But Qincheng was also a disciple of the sect leader, and after being eldest Shixiang for this many years, he was well loved by the other second-generation disciples. Eldest Shiji Gong Sun Qing supposedly was engaged to a disciple in a certain large sect. She wouldn't be spending too much time in the sect, but her influence in the sect was the greatest among all second-generation disciples. She could even influence the sect leader. This was probably due to her fiancé. Third Shiji Sui Xia was deeply loved by all the Shirshu. Yan Le Shirshu had meant for her to take over his work. However, her personality was lively and carefree, uninterested in business. Zuemo sighed ruefully. No place was spared from conflict. Many times, it wasn't a question of whether you fought or not. He and Li Yingfeng weren't unfamiliar with these matters. The outer sect disciples fought even more viciously. The little groups as plentiful as trees in a forest. Both of them were experienced. Zuemo had went from being bullied by all at the beginning to the end where everyone flattered him. From an outsider perspective, his experiences went deep. And Li Yingfeng, to become the top dog of the Eastern Peak female disciples, there were no doubts to her abilities. Zuemo saw it very clearly. Wei Sheng Shixiang might be the leader of the three of them, but on these matters, Shixiang wouldn't pay attention. Other than the sword, Shixiang was indifferent and unconcerned with other matters. Zuemo was certain that Shixiang would be happy not to be eldest Shixiang. That way, he could concentrate on cultivation. Shixiang might not have to consider these things, But he couldn't not consider. Xixiang's talents and power was displayed there. Even Qin Cheng would treat Xixiang with the utmost respect. But Li Yingfeng and his circumstances would be much trickier. There was a large difference between good and bad. Li Yingfeng was also very satisfied with the tacit understanding between the two of them, and thought inside, this Zhuo Shidi's appearance might be frightening. But he had a clever heart. A clever companion was much better than a stupid one. Some things only need to be touched upon. She changed the topic. Coming this time, it's to deliver Jingshi to Shidi. This was undoubtedly the words that Zhuo liked to hear the most. He instantly became alert. Oh, how much? This is 76 second grade Jingshi. That's after taking away the down payment. Li Yingfeng handed Zhuo a jade scroll. This has the detailed accounts. Shidi can take it back for a look. Zhuo took the jade scroll, his happiness unrivaled. The profit this time far surpassed his expectations. Suddenly remembering a matter, Li Yingfeng asked, does Shidi still have some of the great strength pill? Great strength pill. If Li Yingfeng hadn't mentioned it, Zhuo had almost forgotten that Lingdan. Last time, a cultivator had brought it. 2 days ago, he came asking if there was any more. He wants to buy another 10. Each one 20 pieces of second-grade Jingshi. Li Yingfeng said. 10 pills. Each one 20 pieces of second-grade Jingshi. In total, 200 pieces of second-grade Jingshi. That was 2 third-grade Jingshi. Zhuo seemed to see countless Jingshi flying towards him. This was the biggest order he had received up until now. 2 pieces of third-grade Jingshi. The raw materials for great strength pill were only 3 pieces of second-grade Jingshi. With 20 pieces of second-grade Jingshi as the sale price, the profit from one pellet reached 17 pieces of second-grade Jingshi. No wonder his heart was beating so frantically. His only worry right now was the success rate. He had accidentally made great strength pill. He wasn't certain that he could successfully make it. I'll try first. He was still very cautious. And okay, if Shidi gets results, tell me anytime. Finishing, Li Yingfeng left. Seeing Shiji leave, Zhuo instantly rushed into the valley, flipped onto the gray-beaked goose to rush for fragrant ginger yard. One pill was 20 pieces of second-grade Jingshi. This was almost half of his income every year in the past. Entering fragrant ginger yard, he brought a pile of materials to make the great strength pill from Suqing Shiji, and then burrowed into the Dan room. Nothing would make him more enthusiastic than Jingshi. He didn't start the process immediately, but sat down first, and thought back to every action that occurred last time. When his emotions had calmed down, he then folded his legs to enter meditation, and started embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation. For hours later, he woke up from meditation. The face was frozen like it was dead, but the eyes were clear and serene. Zhuo's mind was peaceful, completely absent of the glee he had before. His consciousness, mind and Ling energy were all at their best. Putting the raw materials for great strength pill into the cauldron, Zhuo's hands touched the 8 trigrams plate, and his consciousness silently spread out. Adding in Ling energy, the leaf fire seal formation on the Dan-making cauldron suddenly started, the Ling energy inside the cauldron twisting and turning. In the middle of the process, Zhuo's spell changed and Art of Crimson Flame was cast at full force. A gold line dropped into his hands from the sky, then its direction was deflected, and it entered the cauldron. Up until now, nothing was different compared to last time. Zhuo's heart relaxed slightly. Just before, when he had thought back to every action in great detail, but last time, it had basically been an accident that had created this strange Lingdan. He was muddled about many places, and didn't remember clearly. Suddenly his heart jumped and he cried misfortune. The Ling energy inside the cauldron was vibrating abnormally. As expected, a sharp and burnt smell spread through the Dan room. Zhuo had made enough mental preparations. It wasn't too difficult to accidentally make a new kind of Lingdan. What that needed was luck. But to actually grasp the method for making the Lingdan, that was knowledge. Anything that required study, it had to be built from the ground up. There were no tricks. He knew the general idea, the basic steps, and the raw materials. There was also enough profit. Was there anything other than this that was more appropriate for a greenhorn like Swordsmanship? As to the difficulties involved, Swordsmanship wasn't afraid. In this world, was there something good that would earn Jingshi without any difficulty? Chapter 50. Finding the way after 3 continuous failures, Swordsmanship had to stop experimenting, even though he had sufficient wealth at this point. But it wasn't enough for him to squander it. He had to plan it out and spend wisely. 3 continuous failures. That meant there was a crucial step that he had missed. He entered into deep thought. What he didn't know was that the difficulty of this matter far surpassed the limits of what he could cope with. He had swallowed down some records. But in the area of dan making, he was the newest of the new. His experience was almost zero. Going through speculations to find the basic changes in a certain part of the dan-making process. Many cultivators that were far more experiences may not be able to do it. But no one had told Swordsmanship this point. If Swordsmanship knew this, he most likely would have thrown the matter to the side. Why was he making great strength pill? It was for Jingshi. If it was too difficult, the risk too high, it wasn't profitable. Then he should go to find a more realistic method. He wasn't afraid of difficulty. He was afraid that his ignorance and those questions that were far out of his level would be tangled together. In Swordsmanship's eyes, that was an unprofitable business. But Swordsmanship hadn't realized that the problem he was facing was out of his range. He twisted his brain as he thought in the Dan room. In the sword cave, not even the fingers on a hand could be made out. The rock underneath the feet was ice cold. The blood river not far away roiled relentlessly. Wuxia panted heavily and couldn't persevere any longer, falling to the ground to enter mediation. The exhaustion between his brows were unable to be disguised. He made a sorry figure half naked, about 10 or so scars crisscrossing, alarming to the eye. On his lower half, there was only a short length of pants. He quickly entered mediation, almost immediately after sitting down. In meditation, Wuxia's spine was as straight as a sword, a few hints of dignity and imposingness faintly appearing through his serene appearance. Time slipped away, yet he remained motionless. A black shadow quietly neared Wuxia. In mediation, Wuxia did not detect it. Suddenly, the black shadow leapt at Wuxia. In mediation, Wuxia unexpectedly opened his eyes. With an unknown move, a green sword energy flashed in the dark, and the shadow was split in half. Squeak. The scream the black shadow gave was dissonant as it turned into black smoke and disappeared without a trace. Wuxia stood up from the cold rock ground, his face unaffected. In his eyes were an eternal resolve. Barely visible was sword essence roiling behind. In the silence and darkness, he raised his bare foot, following the blood river, as he slowly and steadily headed deeper. In a place extremely far away from Wuxia. Stars in daytime. Yes. This matter has alarmed many people. There are already many that are rushing to investigate in Wuxia. Some people say that stars in daytime is a great treasure appearing. Great treasure appearing? The person who spoke had heavy disdain. People die for wealth, bird die for food. This rationale is unchanging. Then we send someone. Pay attention to this matter. The person who spoke gave an unquestionable order. Yes, in the fragrant ginger yard of Wukong Mountains, seeing Shifeng Rong come out of the Dan room, Su Qing hurriedly followed. She could become the first seat of the outer sect disciples of fragrant ginger yard. One point was she was obedient and could listen, and she was reliable at her job. The other important reason was that she could tolerate Shifeng Rong's strange temper. Shifeng Rong looked at the surroundings and furrowed her brows. Where's your Xixiang? Su Qing hurried responded. After Xixiang entered the Dan room a few days ago, he hasn't come out. Dan room? What Dan is he making? Shifeng Rong's brow smoothed as she asked casually. It seemed that Swordsmanship was really focused on Dan making. She was very satisfied. It's probably fasting pills. Xixiang had bought some materials for fasting pills from me a few days ago. Su Qing answered. She had been at Fragrant Ginger Yard for a long time, and her experience in the area of Dan was much deeper than Swordsmanship fasting pills. Shifeng Rong's brows furrowed again as she said discontent. Why is he still making fasting pills now? How can he improve that way? Fasting pills were the most basic dan. It couldn't even be considered a ling dan. As a Zhuji cultivator, it was a very comical thing to spend effort on that. Su Qing's heart jumped, and she regretted what she had just said. If Shi Xiang was punished by Shu because of what she said, it would be bad for her. As she spoke, Shi Fengrong moved in front of the door to Zuomo's dan room. Without knocking, she pushed open the door. Once the door was open, a thick and choking burning smell rushed out. Shi Fengrong's expression became even uglier. Failure at making fasting pills? Was it that the 5 fasting pills last time had been brought to deceive her? Her expression became dark. Zuo was like a puppet, blankly sitting on the ground. He didn't even notice Shi Fengrong and Su Qing entering. Shi Fengrong noticed that Zuomo's empty eyes were full of blood, and the rage inside slightly decreased. She could see that Zuo was deep in thought. Suppressing the fire inside, she didn't disturb Zuo, walking straight to the waste piled beside the cauldron. It really was the materials for fasting pills. She was sure after one look. The rage inside instantly shot up again. She decided that later she would have Zuo make one in front of her. Her gaze was just going to move away from the waste when it suddenly stopped. She bent down and started to flip through the waste, and occasionally took up a bit to examine carefully. Su Qing was so envious. She sighed. Inner sect disciples were really inner sect disciples. She had spent so many years at Fragrant Ginger Yard, but had never seen Shu been this concerned for another disciple. Zuo only managed to wake up at this time. Seeing that 2 more people were in his dan room, the fire that had formed due to his struggles shot up. It was common knowledge that the dan room wasn't a place that others were allowed to enter, especially when making dan. That could easily cause the dan to fail. But when he saw who the person was, the curses that had reached his mouth instantly shrunk back into his stomach. Danger! It's a catastrophe. He hurriedly stood up and respectfully gave a bow to Shi Fengrong. Master. You are making that lingdan from last time? Shi Fengrong's head didn't even rise as she unconcernedly crouched by the waist. Yes, Zuo obediently answered. But I haven't succeeded once yet. Shi Fengrong threw away the waste in her hands and stood up, the expression on her face cold. When you don't know how to walk, you want to run? Hearing this, Zuo sweated and said, Please, master, give me guidance. In the path of dan making, the amount of ways to change the recipes involved, there are too many that cannot be passed on through just words. You should first follow the records. Form a good foundation before considering these matters. Finishing, Shi Fengrong left with a cold face. Returning to the Little West Wind Yard, Zuo was extremely disheartened. He had thought that he had a method for earning lots of jingshi, but it was really just a mirage, unable to be touched. In the next few days, Zuo was somewhat dispirited. There were no jingshi that could be earned, no contribution points that could be earned, no sword scriptures that could be practiced. With no other choice, Zuo could only practice embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation. Sitting above the ling vein in the rock room, Zuo woke up from meditation. Embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation, which had always progressed rapidly, had started to slow down recently. This was the first time that Zuo had encountered something like this after breaking through 1 breath. Was he going to break through 2 breaths? According to the records in embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation, after 1 breath was 2 breaths. If one could achieve 2 breaths, not only would the entire body's points be able to breathe, but at that time, his presence could be restrained. Many people that had higher cultivations wouldn't be able to detect it. This spell was much better than those concealing spells recorded in Elder Wei Nan's jade sticks. Thinking about that, Zuo suddenly remembered that Elder Wei Nan had made dan, and was a ling plant farmer. Would he have met similar problems? Once the idea was seated, he hurriedly took out the jade sticks and looked carefully. As expected, he quickly made a discovery. In Elder Wei Nan's dan-making experiences, Zuo found a similar method. But what Elder Wei Nan used wasn't a fire method, but a rarely found water method. There were many methods to make lingdan, and they all couldn't be counted. The most mainstream one right now was naturally using a cauldron, which was the fire method. The core of the fire method was using the power of the fire to stimulate the Ling energy in the materials. Then the Ling energy of different attributes would be merged together to form a Ling Dan. However, many Ling herbs and grasses were of the Yin attribute, like those Ling grasses grown in water. If fire was used, it would ruin their effects. At this time, it required a different method such as the water method. Other than water and fire, there were still countless other methods of Dan making. Water was warm and gentle, far from the fierceness and power of fire. So most water methods required a longer time to form Dan. The path it walked was nurturing the Dan. Only now did Zhuo know that the cold spring in the rock room had such a purpose. Before, he had completely dismissed the Ling spring. He had wondered why Elder Wei Nan had made a spring in the rock room, since after cultivators reached Juji, they almost didn't need to consume anything. The jade stick recorded a method that Elder Wei Nan used with little art of cloud and rain to make moisture Dan. Moisture Dan was a kind of Dan that couldn't enter the grade. Its use was even more frivolous. It could change a person's appearance and skin, but it was only effective for cultivators with Lianqi 3rd level or below. This kind of Dan that Zhuo felt had no use at all. After Elder Wei Nan used little art of cloud and rain to make it, it entered the rank of 1st grade. Its effectiveness had greatly improved. It could improve the features of cultivators that did not go above Juji. According to what the jade stick said, this became one of the important ways Elder Wei Nan made wealth. But due to the fact the time used in the water method, Elder Wei Nan only used this method for a period of time before switching to a different method. Different from Zhuo's accident, Elder Wei Nan's investigations were extremely thorough and were recorded very clearly. Elder Wei Nan though that the reason that those two could combine was due mostly to water. Little art of cloud and rain was the classic water element spell. It was naturally constructive when paired with the water method. There were also large amounts of records on his analysis of the reasons he failed. Zhuo pondered each character as he kept on reading, his thoughts becoming clearer. No wonder he could make great strength pill. Art of Crimson Flame belonged to fire, and the method the fasting pill used was the fire method. Using Art of Crimson Flame to collect the essence of the sun into the fasting pill, that became the great strength pill. There was only one crucial point. Fire. Chapter 51 Attack Fire. The essence of Art of Crimson Flame was fire, and inside the cauldron was the Li Fire Seal formation. This was the reason that Zhuo could make great strength pill. However, what Art of Crimson Flame condensed was essence of the sun, and unfortunately the fire that the Li Fire Seal formation inside the cauldron provided was too low grade. Originally in the process, the Li Fire Seal formation should have been the primary flame, and the essence of the sun, that Art of Crimson Fire concentrated, should have been the auxiliary. Right now, the sun essence was stronger than the Li Fire Seal formation, so naturally problems would occur. He recognized where the problem was. Zhuo instantly had several ideas on how to solve it. The most feasible method was to lessen the sun essence concentrated by Art of Crimson Flame. The least feasible was changing the cauldron to a cauldron with a much higher grade Li Fire Seal formation. And the boldest method was to change the relationship between primary and auxiliary, to have Art of Crimson Flame as primary, Li Fire Seal formation as auxiliary. Zhuo chose the first option. He felt the possibility of success with the first one the highest. After thinking it through, he started to prepare. What he needed to do first was to be able to precisely control Art of Crimson Flame. Before this, he had never thought about accurately controlling Art of Crimson Flame. For Zhuo, if the sun essence concentrated by Art of Crimson Flame was used on the Ling plants, naturally the more the better. In reality it also seemed so. Zhuo had never found a situation where Art of Crimson Flame was overused. Why would he have thought about how to precisely control Art of Crimson Flame? For him, this was a new experience. Thankfully, compared to the other spells, the 5 basic spells of a Ling plant farmer were his most familiar ones. In a short period of time, he grasped the basics of condensing essence of the sun. But when Zhuo once again tried to buy the raw materials of fasting pills from Su Qing, Su Qing's eyes as they stared at him were slightly weird. Buying a large pile of fasting pill ingredients, Zuemo secluded himself in the Dan room and started his new experiment. Failure. Still failure. Failure. Zuemo wasn't panicked because of his failures. Instead, he was very steady and calm. He could feel that he was getting closer to success. This feeling was so strong that quite a few times, he had assumed he would succeed next time. The 9th time, even as the last step was completed, there was no burning smell. Zuemo's heartbeat quickened. He swallowed his saliva and nervously opened the cauldron. A fasting pill with glimmers of gold quietly laid at the bottom of the cauldron. There wasn't any cheering or jumping. Zuemo's face was expressionless. He stared dumbly as he muttered, "Gu can finally become rich." Finishing, his eyes turned dark and with a bang, he fell onto the floor in a dead sleep. So tiring. In Wukong Hall, Pei Yuan Ran's face was ashen as he looked at the two kneeling below. Luo Li and Hao Min were frightened. Seated above, Shifeng Rong's expression was full of anger again. She had always put great importance on the medicinal fields of Cold Mist Valley, which was why she had given them over for Hao Min to care for. She hadn't thought that Hao Min would so seriously neglect her duty. The expression on Yin Lu and Xing Yan's faces weren't much better. Wukong's sword sect might only be a small sect, but their rules had always been strict. It wasn't alarming that the others had left, but both had duties, yet they had sneaked out to travel for such a long time. So they were certainly going to get heavily punished. Zuemo woke up and found that he was still in the Dan room. He climbed up, and looked at the great strength pill he had made before releasing a breath. So he hadn't been dreaming. He was too lazy to go back to the rock room. He decided to sit in the Dan room and meditate to recover Ling energy. When his Ling energy had recovered, he started to make great strength pill again. He didn't know if it was that he had failed too many times before, but the next attempts, he didn't fail once. Feeling slightly tired, Zuemo stood up. After searching for methods for a few days, his body and heart were really very tired and needed rest. Meditation could recover Ling energy, but could not substitute for rest. Pushing open the door to leave the Dan room, the sunlight stabbed Zuemo's eyes. He raised a hand to cover them. However, the feeling of the sun landing on his body was really good. Successfully making a Dan, Zuemo's mood was very good. Suddenly, he saw the person walking towards him and blanked. Wasn't that Hao Min Shiji? She and Luo Li Shixiang had returned? Thoughts swirled in Zuemo's brain, and he decided to give a greeting. Hao Min, sure. Only when he walked closer did he find it was not good. Hao Min's eyes were red, clearly having cried. Just having been scolded. Hao Min saw Zuemo, and suddenly remembered that Cold Mist Valley had been given to this zombie face to care for. When she suddenly thought of the scolding and sternness of the sect leader and master, her anger rose. It had to be this guy who did it. Otherwise, how would Master have known about Cold Mist Valley? Once the idea emerged, she felt that this zombie face was hateful and resentment rose. An outer sect disciples dared to trick this lady? Her brow raised, without a word she raised her hand, heading for Zuemo's face? Zuemo, who had remained alert, reacted very quickly and grabbed Hao Min's wrist, asking in a deep voice, "Shiji, what are you doing?" The anger in Zuemo's heart rose up as well. Before, he wouldn't have any choice when he encountered something like this, but now, the two of them were on equal ground. He wouldn't act first, but he didn't have to swallow and bear it. "You dare?" Hao Min ground her teeth, extremely enraged. "Even a trash like you dare to offend me?" Before her words landed, her free left hand headed for Zuemo's face, not giving Zuemo the chance to speak. Zuemo's pupils suddenly shrank, his eyes becoming frigid. The right hand that had practiced countless finger movements was extremely fast and nimble. Before Hao Min's hand could reach Zuemo's face, she suddenly felt her eyes blur and pop. A slap landed on her face. Hao Min blinked after the slap. Her face was burning in pain. She looked in disbelief at Zuemo Su Qing, who had coincidentally just left the yard, saw this scene, and almost screamed out in shock. Her reaction was very quick, as she used her hands to cover her mouth. Zuemo looked coldly at Hao Min, his voice frigid. "Has Shiji woken up?" Giving a penetrating look at Hao Min, He released Hao Min's wrist and took a step back. For some reason, when Hao Min met Zuomo's gaze, it was like she was completely frozen, her body cold. She shuddered all over, her face going green and red. Terror, embarrassment, anger, it was all mixed together. She actually forgot to speak. Oh right. Shiji just returned and might not know the latest news. Zuomo, who had turned around, stopped and said coldly, "This little brother was lucky and was taken into the inner sect, and I am now under master to learn dan-making." He turned around his zombie face, showing off 2 rows of eerie white teeth. "Shiji, please take care of me." Su Qing stared with wide eyes as Zuomo left. The blow the scene gave her was too big. Before Zuomo, Hao Ming was the only inner sect disciples in Fragrant Ginger Yard. She had been arrogant and despotic to the extreme. Everyone had feared her. For some reason, when Su Qing saw the 5-fingered handprint on Hao Min's face, she felt unspeakably exhilarated. Glancing at Hao Min, who was still dazedly standing in her original spot, Su Qing decided to quietly leave. If Hao Min Shiji knew that she had seen this incident, then she would be in a miserable situation. Retreating, Su Qing still felt some disbelief. Offer Zuomo formed. Zuo Shixiang, who had been so agreeable, usually actually had a time when he was this scary. Zuomo walked out of Fragrant Ginger Yard, his hand imperceptibly trembling. His heart was full of terror. It wasn't terror due to Hao Min but terror of himself. Just then, in his anger, there seemed to have been a voice saying to him, "Kill her! Kill her!" That impulse was so strong and clear. So strong that what he had given wasn't a slap but sword energy. At what time had he become so ruthless? This discovery made him very nervous. In the stories, all the Yaoma were terrible and evil, villains who killed like it was their life. Was the cause practicing embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation, causing his personality had been secretly influenced? Or was it Pu Yao that was behind it? He stopped, closed his eyes and took a deep breath before exhaling. All the negative emotions seemed to have been vented out in this breath. When he opened his eyes, his gaze resumed its clarity, his hands resumed steadiness. It was probably that he was too tired this little while. Zuomo hadn't practiced embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation for a short period of time. This had never happened before. As to Pu Yao, the guy was a perverse one, but he was definitely a cautious perverse. He would never actively stir up trouble. Zuomo found that Pu Yao was still extremely wary of his elders, especially Exinyan Shirshu. Returning to Little West Wind Yard, Zuomo decided to not think at all and rest for a time. He put himself on the guard, reminding himself to be careful and attentive. For a whole day, he did nothing except sleep. He was woken up by the pink paper crane. Yi heard that there were stars appearing during the day. Was it fun? It was still the graceful writing that Zuomo was familiar with. Never heard of it. Zuomo answered confidently. Stars appearing during the day, how was it possible? In any case, he was certain that he had never seen such an abnormal thing. But the news I heard was really like that. Yi has to be careful. Stars appearing during the day is an ill omen. It's possibly Yaoma. Zuomo's heart jumped. Yaoma. Such a familiar smell. Pu Yao had crept up beside Zuomo. He stared at the pink paper in Zuomo's hands and then smiled. So it's that little girl. Zuomo felt that Pu Yao's smile was very cold. You recognize her? He asked carefully. Recognize? Pu Yao's bloody right eye narrowed into a line as he smiled happily. Of course I recognize her. His gaze landed on the paper in Zuomo's hands and snickered. Yaoma? This little girl is interesting, I like her. Leaving behind a stream of meaningful laughter, Pu Yao disappeared, leaving behind Zuomo with a head full of confusion. Zuomo really didn't have good feelings towards the owner of this paper crane. Anything, once it was forced, the feeling would be very bad. Chatting was also the same. However, it really had been him that brought it upon himself. Zuomo could do nothing about it. His own actions, he had to take responsibility. In the following days, after Zuomo felt he had rested enough, he returned back to his glorious mission of earning Jingshi. In one go, he made 20 great strength pills, and gave them all to Liang Feng. Liang Feng also gave the Jinji jade stick that she had mentioned last time to him, and reminded him that his conflict with Hao Min had spread through the entire sect, and he should be careful. When Zuomo heard this, he knew it was going to be bad, but he quickly composed himself after some thought. This kind of thing, dodging it wasn't effective. But when he returned to the mouth of West Wing Valley, he saw the ruins of the Jinji and the arrogantly standing Luo Li Shixiang. Zuomo stopped in his steps. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.